I stood on my own front porch, grocery bag still in my shaking hand, as the new locks clicked shut behind me. The smell of cedar, the one I'd built into these walls 50 years ago, drifted through the cracks like a ghost that no longer knew my name. My son's voice echoed through the door, flat and final. "You don't belong here anymore, Dad." The house I built, the home I carved from sweat and love, stood silent. Belonging, stolen in a single sentence. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Morning light slanted through the kitchen window, laying golden lines across the worn oak floors. Thomas Miller bent over the second stair, tightening a loose screw with slow precision. The faint smell of pine dust mixed with coffee in the air. Each creak of the old house was familiar, a kind of heartbeat that had kept rhythm with his life for nearly 5 decades. He hummed softly as he worked, the tune half-whistled, half-breathed, his late wife Evelyn's favorite melody. The sound floated through the quiet rooms like a ghost that still felt at home. On the counter behind him, a glossy realtor brochure lay half open, its words shouting in bold print, "Top offers for your property." Tom didn't need to read it to know who had left it there. Brian had dropped by yesterday, all charm and hurry, talking about options and market value. Tom had simply nodded, too tired to argue. He'd built this home with his own hands after returning from Vietnam. The beams, the roof, the stone fireplace. It was more than a house. It was proof that a man could turn hard years into something that lasted. He stood, stretching his back, and looked around. Every surface told a story. The faint dents in the kitchen table where Ella had dropped her crayons as a child. The window latch Evelyn used to complain about because it always stuck in the winter. His lips curled faintly. This was his legacy. Quiet, weathered, and alive. "Grandpa?" A familiar voice called from the hallway. He turned, smiling. Ella stood in the doorway with her camera strap around her neck, sunlight catching the copper in her hair. "Morning, sweetheart," he said. "You're up early." "I wanted to film you for my art project," she said, setting up the small tripod near the stairs. "We're doing something about legacy and time." He chuckled. "Well, I've got plenty of both lying around." The camera clicked on, capturing his rough hands as he sanded the banister. Dust shimmered in the light, swirling like slow snow. "Mom says this house is too big for you," she said carefully, her tone hesitant. Tom's sanding stopped for just a moment. "She's right," he said with a small grin, "but it's the right kind of big, keeps me busy." Before she could reply, the front door swung open. Brian's voice filled the hall, confident, clipped, distracted. "Dad, you here?" Tom sighed quietly, wiping his hands on a rag. "In here," he said. Brian appeared in the doorway, sharply dressed in a tailored coat, phone pressed to his ear. "Yeah, I'll call you back," he muttered before hanging up. His eyes scanned the house as if appraising it. "You've been keeping busy," he said, "still fixing things that don't need fixing." "Some things hold up better when you take care of them," Tom replied. Brian smiled faintly, missing the edge in his father's voice. "Look, Dad, Samantha and I were talking. The market's hot right now. You could sell this place and live comfortably somewhere smaller. Assisted living, maybe." Tom's gaze didn't move. "Assisted living? I'm not dying yet." Before Brian could answer, Samantha stepped in, perfume preceding her. "Tom," she said with a polite brightness, "we just think it's time you had less to worry about. This house is a lot for one person." Tom looked at her, then at the stair he'd just repaired. "It's never felt like a lot to me." Samantha smiled tightly. "Of course, but Brian's thinking long-term. It's not practical to keep such a big property for one old man." Ella shifted, lowering her camera. The words hung in the air like smoke. Tom didn't flinch, though something in his chest tightened. He studied them, his son and daughter-in-law, standing there like polite strangers in the home he built from nothing. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his tone calm, dismissive. Brian exhaled with relief. "Good. We'll talk more this weekend." As they turned to leave, Ella glanced at her grandfather, eyes wide with silent apology. The front door closed behind them, and the house seemed to inhale the quiet again. Tom stood motionless for a long moment, listening to the wind brushing against the old windows. He picked up the brochure from the counter, turned it once, then set it face down. "Too big for one old man," he muttered. His voice was steady, but the echo of their words cut deeper than he'd admit. He touched the railing again, feeling the smoothness of the wood beneath his palm. Something real, something that lasted. Outside, the sun dipped lower, painting the walls in amber light. Tom's hum returned, softer now, tinged with melancholy. He didn't see it yet, the small fracture that had begun to spread. But the first crack had already been struck. Quietly, beneath the roof, he once believed unbreakable. The smell of roasted chicken and thyme filled the small dining room, drifting out from the kitchen, where Tom moved with slow, deliberate motions. Cooking was his rhythm, a quiet ritual that still made the old house feel alive. He set out plates on the oak table he'd built himself decades ago. Its surface was scarred with the marks of family meals, school projects, and birthdays. Tonight, he'd hoped those scars might remind everyone what family meant. Ella arrived first, her laughter soft as she helped carry in the salad bowl. "Smells amazing, Grandpa," she said. "Better than Mom's cooking." Tom smiled, the corners of his eyes creasing. "Don't let her hear that," he said. "She might evict me faster." They shared a laugh, just as headlights flashed through the window. Brian's SUV pulled into the driveway, polished and loud. When he entered, he filled the doorway like a man who owned every room he stepped into. "Hey, Dad," he said, dropping his phone on the counter. "Hope dinner's not too heavy. I'm back on my fitness plan." "Just the usual," Tom replied, pouring iced tea into glasses. "You liked it last time." "Yeah, well, that was before I started managing 40 people," Brian said, tugging at his cufflinks. "Gotta keep the image sharp." Samantha followed close behind, perfect hair, perfect smile, a faint scent of designer perfume cutting through the smell of home cooking. "Everything looks cozy," she said, scanning the room like she was appraising it. "It's nice that you still do everything yourself, Tom." He nodded. "Old habits. The kitchen still works fine without an app." Her laugh came quick and hollow. "I'm sure it does." They sat. Forks clinked against plates, and for a few quiet minutes, the sound of eating filled the room. Tom hoped the food might bridge the growing distance between them, but it didn't take long for Brian to steer the conversation toward himself. "So," Brian said, slicing into the chicken, "I got the regional promotion. Base salary just over 150 plus bonuses. Company car too. My team's handling 3 new accounts next quarter." Samantha's hand brushed his arm in pride. "He's being modest," she said. "The VP told him he's on track for partner." Ella smiled politely, though her eyes flicked toward Tom. He simply nodded, chewing slowly. "That's good, son. Hard work paying off." Brian leaned back, swirling his drink. "You know, Dad, you'd never believe how different the world is now. It's all about innovation, speed. No one builds things slow anymore. You wouldn't survive in my field for a day." Tom's fork paused midair. "Maybe not," he said evenly, "but I wasn't building for speed. I was building for permanence." Samantha smirked, her tone playful but sharp. "Permanence is lovely, if the world stays the same, but it doesn't. I mean, look around, Tom. People your age are downsizing, simplifying. There's no shame in adapting." Ella set her fork down. "Grandpa's fine," she said, her voice trembling with quiet defiance. "He likes his house. Not everything has to be upgraded." Samantha's brows lifted slightly. "Sweetheart, it's not about upgrading. It's about being practical." Tom looked at Ella, grateful, protective, then turned to Brian. "Your mother used to say, comfort isn't about square footage. It's about people who show up." The table went still. Brian exhaled, half laughing. "Dad, please, let's not get sentimental. This isn't about Mom. It's just reality. You're 72. You should be thinking about what comes next." "What comes next," Tom said quietly, "is dessert." Ella smiled faintly, but the tension didn't break. It only thickened, an invisible wall forming where warmth used to live. Tom lifted his glass. family, he said, voice steady. Samantha raised hers politely. Brian rolled his eyes. Sure, to family, he muttered. The clink of glasses was dull, almost hollow. No laughter followed. The room felt colder, the light harsher. Tom noticed Ella's shoulders sink slightly. He saw the ghost of Evelyn in the empty chair at the end of the table, the one he'd never moved. When dinner ended, Brian and Samantha left quickly, claiming early meetings. The sound of their car faded down the street. Ella hugged her grandfather and whispered, "Don't let them change anything." Then she was gone too. Tom stood alone amid half-eaten plates and empty glasses. Slowly, he gathered the dishes, the porcelain clinking softly like distant echoes of something breaking. Each scrape of the plate against the table felt like a betrayal he couldn't name yet. The silence afterward was thick, the kind that seeps into the walls. He stared at the empty chair again. "To family," he whispered, setting the last plate down. The house didn't answer. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator filled the air, steady and cold. The next Sunday afternoon carried that brittle quiet that comes before a storm. Tom sat in his armchair by the window, the newspaper open but unread. Outside, snow threatened but never fell, hanging heavy in the gray sky. The fire in the hearth crackled faintly, the only sound in the room until he heard Brian's SUV pull up the drive. The tires crunched over gravel, confident, hurried. Tom folded the paper carefully. He already sensed this wasn't a social visit. Brian entered without knocking, coat collar up, tablet tucked under his arm. "Dad," he said, "all business, no warmth. Got a few things to go over with you." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Things?" "Yeah," Brian said, taking a seat opposite him, spreading papers across the coffee table. "I've been talking with Samantha and, well, we came up with a plan, a solution." Tom's chest tightened. "A solution to what?" Brian leaned forward, the salesman tone sliding in. "The house, Dad. You're 72. It's too big, too much to maintain. The stairs alone are a hazard. You could sell it and make a comfortable sum. Split the proceeds. You take your share, live somewhere easier, maybe an assisted living place. The rest would go toward keeping the property in the family name." Tom stared at him, the words sinking slowly, like stones dropping through deep water. "Assisted living?" His voice was low, almost amused. "You think I built this home just to die in a rented room somewhere?" Brian hesitated but pressed on. "It's not about that. It's about being practical. You've had a good run here, Dad, but it's time to think ahead. You can't keep fixing this place forever." Tom's hands rested on his knees, still as stone. "I built this house before you were even born," he said. "Every nail in these walls, every board, I set with my own hands. I didn't just live here. I made it." Brian sighed, his patience thinning. "And I respect that, I do. But times change. Houses age. You've done your part." Before Tom could answer, Samantha stepped into the living room, her tone polished, professional. "He's right, Tom," she said smoothly. "We're not trying to push you out. We just think it's time for a transition. You could have your own space, somewhere modern, where things are easier. It's not like you'll live here forever." The sentence hung in the air like smoke. Ella, sitting quietly on the couch beside the stairs, froze mid-sketch. Her pencil snapped in her fingers. "Mom," she said sharply, "do you even hear yourself?" Samantha blinked, her voice cooling. "Sweetheart, I'm just being realistic. Your grandfather deserves comfort, not chores." Ella stood, anger flushing her cheeks. "He's comfortable here. You're talking like he's some burden you need to relocate." "Ella," Brian warned, his voice firm, "this is an adult conversation." She laughed bitterly. "Yeah, well, maybe the adults should listen to the one person here who still cares." Tom's jaw clenched, the old carpenter's veins standing out on his hands. He didn't move, didn't shout. He just looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw not the boy who once handed him nails in the workshop, but a stranger wearing his face. "I'm not selling this house," he said quietly. Brian exhaled through his nose, half frustration, half disbelief. "Dad, you're being stubborn." "No," Tom said. "I'm being steady." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Ella's eyes glistened. She turned and stormed upstairs, her door slamming like a gavel. Samantha crossed her arms, muttering something about pride. Brian rubbed his temples, shaking his head. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said finally. Tom rose slowly, his full height still imposing despite age. "You came into my home," he said, voice steady as oak. "You told me to sell it. You told me to move. You told me I don't belong here anymore. That's what's hard, son, watching you forget where you came from." Brian gathered the papers stiffly, avoiding his father's gaze. "You'll change your mind," he said. Tom didn't answer. He just stared into the fire, the flames dancing over his reflection in the glass. When the door closed, behind them, the echo lingered longer than it should have. He looked toward the stairs where Ella had gone, then at the papers left behind on the table. His hand hovered above them, but didn't touch. Outside, the wind began to rise, rattling the windows. Inside, the house held its breath. 3 days passed, quiet but heavy. The kind of silence that carries questions no one wants to ask. Tom spent his mornings in the workshop behind the house, sanding an old chair that needed new legs. The steady rhythm of his tools helped drown out the echoes of that last conversation with Brian, but the words still returned in fragments. "It's not like you'll live here forever." That Friday, the mail arrived late. Tom walked back inside, sorting through envelopes, until his eyes caught a brown folder lying neatly on his desk. He hadn't left it there. The label read, "Property Ownership Review, Miller Residence." Inside were a series of neatly printed forms, clipped together with a silver pen resting on top. At first glance, they looked official. Too official. Tom's name appeared beside Brian's, followed by words he hadn't seen before: transfer of ownership for tax efficiency and estate management. His jaw tightened. "Tax efficiency," he muttered. The phrase sounded clean, but something about it left a bitter taste. He reached for the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in months. "Clara Lawson," came the warm, steady voice on the other end. "Clara, it's Tom," he said. "You still remember my old trust paperwork?" "I remember everything about it," she replied. "Why?" "I've got some new documents here. Brian says it's for taxes. Can you take a look?" Her tone changed, sharpened. "Don't sign anything until I do." Tom looked at the papers again. The legal jargon wound around itself like barbed wire. Confusing, deliberate. "He said it's just an update," he said quietly. "Tom," Clara said firmly, "you've seen enough life to know the words, 'just an update,' never mean what they sound like. Bring it by my office." He promised he would, but evening came, and with it, Brian's car lights flashing through the living room window. Tom hadn't moved the folder. It sat there, untouched, the pen gleaming faintly beside it. "Hey, Dad," Brian said as he walked in, coat still buttoned. "Glad you got the documents. I wanted to explain before you panicked." Tom crossed his arms. "I wasn't panicking. Just curious why my name's moving down the page." Brian smiled easily. "It's for tax purposes. Keeps everything simpler when the time comes. You'll still be the primary resident. This just helps with estate stuff. Saves us money in the long run." Tom studied him. The same confident tone he used as a teenager when spinning half-truths about curfews and grades. "Your mother would have read every word twice before touching a pen," he said softly. Brian laughed lightly. "Mom was cautious. I'm efficient." Before Tom could answer, Samantha entered from the hallway, her perfume subtle but sharp. "You should really listen to him, Tom," she said sweetly. "Brian's just making sure everything's handled right. You don't want the government taking half of what you built." Tom's eyes flicked toward her, noticing the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "And what do you want taken?" She tilted her head, all grace and confidence. "Peace of mind for everyone." Tom hesitated. He could hear Clara's voice in the back of his head. "Don't sign anything." But then Brian's tone softened, the businessman slipping away for a moment. "Dad, it's me," he said, almost pleading. "You know I'd never do anything to hurt you. It's just paperwork. You trust me, right?" The word trust landed heavier than he expected. For a long moment, the room was still except for the quiet ticking of the mantel clock. Tom's gaze fell on a framed photo nearby. Brian as a boy, standing on the porch with a toy hammer, proud of the crooked birdhouse they'd built together. A father's memory can make even the sharpest instinct dull. He picked up the pen. "It's just paperwork," he repeated, half to himself. The nib touched the page, and with one steady stroke, he signed his name. Samantha's lips curved slightly, a faint, knowing smile, before she turned toward the window. "Perfect," she murmured. "That'll make things much smoother." Outside, a flash of lightning split the gray horizon, followed by a low growl of thunder. Rain began tapping against the glass, soft at first, then harder, faster. The house groaned with the wind, as if warning him of something he couldn't yet see. Brian gathered the folder, tucking it under his arm. "Thanks, Dad," he said, already heading toward the door. "You did the right thing." When they were gone, Tom stood alone by the desk, staring at the faint ink drying on the page. A storm raged outside, and for the first time, he felt it wasn't weather, but something deeper, something coming for him. He turned off the lamp, but the thunder rolled again, long and low, echoing through the walls of the house he thought he still owned. The late afternoon sky was the color of dull steel when Tom pulled his truck into the driveway, a paper bag of groceries resting on the seat beside him. The tires crunched over gravel, the sound familiar, grounding. He turned off the ignition and sat for a moment, breathing in the quiet. The storm from 2 nights ago had left branches scattered across the lawn, but the house still stood solid, unshaken, his anchor. He grabbed the groceries, humming under his breath as he walked up the porch steps. The front door was unlocked. That was odd. He always locked it when he left. He stepped inside, and his heart stumbled at the sight before him. The hallway was lined with cardboard boxes, stacked neatly against the wall. Labels scrawled in black marker read, "Kitchen, living room, master bedroom." At first, he thought maybe Ella had decided to help him organize, but then he noticed the handwriting, not hers and not his. "Samantha," he called, setting the grocery bag down slowly. Her voice floated from the living room, bright and casual. "Oh, you're back early." He walked toward her, each step heavier than the last. Samantha stood near the fireplace, hair pulled back, a paint sample fan in her hand. The furniture had been covered in white sheets. Tools and measuring tape lay on the floor like an invasion of strangers. "What's all this?" Tom asked, his voice measured but tight. She smiled, too easily. "We're starting renovations. You'll love it, Tom. We're opening up the living space, new paint, new lighting. It'll feel fresh." He blinked at her, as if trying to translate her words into something that made sense. "We?" he repeated slowly. "Whose renovations?" Before she could answer, Brian appeared from the hallway, sleeves rolled up, clipboard in hand. "Hey, Dad, don't freak out. It's just time for some changes. We're modernizing the place. New floors, upgraded kitchen. You'll thank us later." Tom stared at him. "You're what?" "Taking over," Brian said matter-of-factly. "The old layout's cramped. Samantha's already talked to the contractors. We're moving fast on this." Tom's breath caught. The words were too casual, too certain. "Taking over?" he repeated, the echo slow and disbelieving. "This isn't some rental property, Brian. This is my home." Brian's tone hardened. "Dad, you signed the transfer papers, remember? You agreed to make me co-owner for tax reasons. It's not just your house anymore." The realization hit like cold water down his spine. He looked toward the kitchen counter, where a cluster of unopened paint cans waited beside a new blueprint roll. "You tricked me into signing that," he said quietly. Brian sighed, the kind of sigh reserved for dealing with a stubborn client. "No one tricked you. You just didn't understand the paperwork. Look, this is good for everyone. You'll still have a room here, but it's time we made this place livable for the next generation." Tom's fingers curled slightly at his sides. "Livable? I've lived here my whole life. I built these walls before you even knew how to walk." Samantha stepped closer, her tone sugar-sweet. "Tom, please don't make this difficult. We're doing this with love. You'll be so much happier once everything's updated. The house has to evolve, and so do you." Her words landed soft, but cut sharp. Tom looked from her to Brian, searching for any trace of the son he used to know. He found none. Only calculation. Only ambition. He swallowed hard. "You didn't ask me," he said. Brian's jaw clenched. "We didn't have to. You signed. It's done." The air thickened. Tom took one slow step forward, his voice low but steady. "You can change the floors, the paint, the windows, but you can't change what this house means. Not to me." Brian's eyes flashed with impatience. "You're not listening, Dad. You don't belong here anymore." The words struck like a nail through wood, sudden, final, splitting something deep inside him. For a moment, everything went silent. Even the ticking clock seemed to stop. Samantha's eyes flicked toward Brian, surprised at the bluntness, but she didn't speak. Tom stood frozen, the echo of those words hanging between them. Then, slowly, he nodded, not in agreement, but in disbelief. "Say that again," he whispered. Brian looked away. "Let's not make this ugly." Tom's voice hardened, brittle as glass. "You just did." He turned away from them, his shoulders squared but trembling, and walked to the window. Outside, dark clouds gathered once again on the horizon, the wind stirring through the trees. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, smaller, older, but still unbroken. Behind him, the rustle of packing tape sounded like betrayal being sealed shut. The storm hadn't yet reached the house, but Tom could feel it coming. In the air, in his bones, in the silence that followed the words no father should ever hear. Morning broke gray and cold, the kind of quiet that makes every sound feel louder than it should. Tom stepped out of his truck with a small bag of groceries and a newspaper tucked under his arm. The frost still clung to the grass, silver and brittle. His breath clouded the air as he walked up the porch steps, humming softly like he always did when starting the day. But when he reached for the door handle, it didn't turn. He frowned, tried again. The knob rattled uselessly. The deadbolt was new, gleaming, unfamiliar. For a second, his brain refused to understand. He jiggled the key, forced it once, twice, harder, nothing. The sound echoed through the porch, hollow, final. Then he noticed the porch light fixture above him, replaced. The welcome mat, gone. His doormat, the one Evelyn had hand-stitched 40 years ago, had vanished. In its place was a newer one that read, "Home Sweet Home" in block letters. The irony twisted deep in his gut. Tom stepped back slowly, scanning the yard. His truck sat where it always did, old and loyal. But beside it, near the curb, were several black trash bags, 6 of them, neatly tied. His name was written on masking tape across one. Inside, he saw the outline of his flannel shirts, a stack of photo frames, and a worn hammer with his initials still burned into the handle. For a long moment, he just stood there, his breath thick in the cold air. The neighborhood was waking. A dog barked, a car door shut somewhere down the street. Curtains shifted in nearby windows. People were watching. He could feel their eyes, their pity disguised as curiosity. "Tom?" It was Mrs. Jenkins from next door, standing on her porch in her robe. Her voice was soft, hesitant. "Everything all right?" He forced a small nod. "Just a misunderstanding," he said quietly, though his voice cracked around the edges. She lingered for a second, then turned away, pretending not to see. Tom bent down and picked up one of the bags. His hands shook, not from the cold, but from something heavier. He carried it to his truck, setting it gently in the back, one after another, as if packing pieces of his life into exile. The front door opened behind him. Brian stepped out, phone in hand, his tone casual. "Dad, I was going to call you. We had to change the locks. Contractor's policy. Liability reasons." Tom turned slowly. "Contractor's policy?" he repeated. "Yeah," Brian said, not quite meeting his eyes. "You'll still have your room once everything's finished. But for now, it's just easier if you stay somewhere else." Tom stared at his son, words failing him. Samantha appeared behind Brian, arms crossed, sipping coffee. "It's only temporary," she said. "You'll be more comfortable at a motel or—" "Stop," Tom said, voice firm. The single word carried years of command. The quiet that followed was suffocating. "You've already made your choice. No need to dress it up." Brian sighed, glancing at his phone. I'll call you once the renovations are done. Tom nodded once. You do that. He turned back toward his truck, gripping the last bag. Something slipped from the front pocket of his jacket, an old envelope. Inside was the copy of the deed Clara had helped him file years ago, the one he'd almost forgotten he had. He unfolded it slowly, the paper creased and faded, his name printed clearly at the top. Thomas A. Miller, owner and trustee. For the first time that morning, the shaking stopped. He folded it carefully, slid it back into his pocket, and looked up at the house. The windows he'd installed himself stared down at him like eyes that no longer recognized him. The humiliation burned hot beneath his ribs, but beneath the burn was something steadier, a pulse of resolve. He'd built that house once from the ground up. Every beam, every nail, every plank had come from his hands. They could lock the doors, change the lights, throw his things to the curb, but they couldn't erase the work. The home would always remember its maker. He climbed into his truck, started the engine, and backed slowly out of the driveway. In the rearview mirror, the house shrank behind him, its porch light flickering faintly against the cold morning. Inside, the silence deepened. Upstairs, Ella sat in her room, clutching her sketchbook to her chest. She'd seen it all from her window, her grandfather's truck pulling away, her mother's arms folded, her father pacing with his phone. She pressed her forehead against the glass and let the tears come. Down the street, Tom turned the corner without looking, back. The sun was breaking through the clouds now, pale and distant. He reached into his pocket, feeling the edge of the deed beneath his fingers. I built it once, he murmured under his breath. I can rebuild everything again, including them. His voice was calm, steady, the sound of a man who'd lost something sacred but refused to stay broken. The small guest room smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Tom set his duffel bag down beside the bed, a single, quiet thud that sounded far heavier than it should have. The floral curtains swayed in the evening breeze, and the lamp on the nightstand cast a soft, forgiving glow. For the first time in 50 years, he wasn't sleeping under his own roof. Clara Lawson appeared in the doorway, arms folded, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. I still can't believe he did it, she said sharply. Change the locks? Put your things on the curb like some stranger? I should have been there. Tom sat on the edge of the bed, removing his boots one at a time. It's done, he said quietly. No sense in yelling at the wind. Clara crossed the room and set down a steaming cup of tea on the nightstand. Don't tell me you're defending him. He shook his head. I'm not defending. I'm conserving. Conserving? He looked up, meeting her eyes. Anger wastes precision. Clara stared at him for a moment, her face softening. She'd known Tom since before Evelyn passed, back when their lives had still been filled with dinner parties and building plans. She knew his silences well. When Tom Miller went quiet, it wasn't surrender. It was calculation. Still, she couldn't help the tremor of indignation in her voice. He used your trust against you, Tom. You raised him better. Tom exhaled slowly, the sound rough, steady. I raised him honest. Somewhere along the line, he learned to value convenience more than conscience. She nodded, pacing the small room. Let me see those papers you mentioned. He reached into his jacket and handed her the crumpled copy of the deed, the one he'd carried like a lifeline since the day he was locked out. Clara unfolded it on the desk and slipped on her glasses. Her eyes scanned the lines quickly, practiced. Then she frowned, muttering under her breath. Something's not right here. Tom watched her work. The rhythmic sound of her fingers tapping the desk reminded him of Evelyn's habit when she was thinking through a puzzle. After a few minutes, Clara turned toward him. Do you have the trust's registration number? Top drawer, he said. Old file folder. Should still have the original. She retrieved it, flipping through the yellowed papers until she found the line she needed. Then she moved to her laptop, typing with sharp, deliberate strokes. The glow of the screen lit her face in cool blue light as she pulled up county property records. Silence stretched between them, the kind of silence that vibrates with both hope and fear. Finally, Clara stopped typing. There it is, she said, pointing to the document on screen. Thomas Miller Revocable Living Trust. Active unamended. Tom frowned. Active? Yes. Your son filed an application to transfer ownership, but it was never finalized. The county office shows it pending, incomplete. She turned to him, eyes fierce. That means, legally, the title still sits under your trust. Tom blinked, the realization spreading slow and warm through his chest. He never finished the transfer. Clara nodded. He started the process, probably thought your signature gave him all the leverage he needed, but he didn't record the change with the county. He never actually got ownership. Tom leaned back in the chair, exhaling a long, tired breath. For days, he'd been carrying the weight of losing everything. Now, a faint ember flickered where despair had been. So, after all that noise, he said softly, the deed never left my hands. Clara's expression softened into something like pride. Poetic, isn't it? She said, all that scheming undone by his own negligence. Tom smiled faintly, not triumphant, not yet, but aware that the game had shifted. He picked up the deed, running a finger over the edge of the paper. The texture was familiar, like the grain of good wood. He built his plan on shortcuts, he said, and shortcuts don't hold. Clara sat beside him, the anger still simmering in her voice. So, what now? You could march into his house tomorrow and... He stopped her with a small shake of the head. No. Let him think he's won. Let him believe the storm passed. She studied him carefully. And what will you do in the meantime? He looked toward the window, where the streetlight cut a faint line through the curtain. I'll do what builders do, he said quietly. Measure twice. Cut once. Outside, thunder rumbled far off in the distance, faint but steady like a reminder. The storm hadn't left. It was circling back. Tom folded the papers carefully, tucking them into his jacket pocket again. As he did, that spark, small, precise, dangerous, glowed behind his calm eyes. The late afternoon sun painted the sidewalks in long shadows as the final school bell rang. Ella Miller walked quickly, her backpack swinging behind her, every step heavy with purpose. She kept glancing over her shoulder until she reached the quiet corner near Maple Street, where an old pickup truck waited under the shade of a sycamore. The familiar dented fender made her heart ease a little. Tom stepped out, brushing sawdust from his jacket. He smiled softly when he saw her. Didn't think I'd be picking you up like we used to, he said, voice warm but worn. She climbed in, shutting the door quickly. Mom doesn't know I'm here, she whispered. She'd freak if she found out. Tom's eyes flicked. Toward her, then to the road ahead as he started the engine. Then we'll make it quick. They drove in silence to Clara's house, the one with the red mailbox and the wild rose bushes that Evelyn used to love. Inside, Clara was out for errands, leaving them alone in the cozy kitchen. The faint smell of coffee lingered in the air. Ella dropped her backpack on the table and took a deep breath. Grandpa, something's happening at the house. Tom leaned back, his hands clasped loosely on the table. What kind of something? She hesitated, as if saying it aloud might make it more real. Mom's been talking to a realtor. He didn't move. Go on. She told Dad the market's high, and that if they sell now, they can get a better deal before summer. I overheard her on the phone. She said the paperwork's already in her email. Tom's jaw flexed once, the muscle tightening under his skin, but his voice stayed steady. Did your father say anything? Ella shook her head. He didn't stop her. He said they were just testing interest. But, Grandpa, I saw the pictures. They're real. They've already taken photos of the house. Tom closed his eyes briefly. A man who's spent a lifetime building knows when something solid has begun to crack. Not suddenly, but slowly, from the inside out. And you're sure it's listed? Not yet, she said quickly, but Mom said she'd post it privately first. Something about quiet marketing. He nodded, each detail filing away behind his calm expression. You did the right thing coming here, he said softly. I didn't know what else to do, she whispered. They keep saying it's for your own good, but it's not, is it? Tom reached across the table, his calloused hand covering hers. Sometimes people dress selfishness in concern, he said. You don't need to worry about protecting me. You just keep being careful." She nodded, eyes brimming. "What should I do?" He thought for a moment, then said, "If you can, get copies of whatever you find. Messages, photos, listings, anything that proves what they're planning. But quietly. No confrontation." Ella's brows furrowed, her young face already carrying the seriousness of someone much older. "You want evidence." "Proof," he corrected gently, "so when the time comes, truth won't be a matter of opinion." Her lips pressed together in a determined line. "I can do that." Tom's chest swelled with both pride and sadness. She shouldn't have to be part of this. Not her, not at 17. But he also knew this girl had Evelyn's fire in her veins. She wasn't afraid of standing up for what was right. "Promise me you'll stay calm," he said. "Don't argue with them, just observe." "I promise." He smiled faintly. "You've got your grandmother's sense. She always knew when to speak and when to wait." Ella returned the smile, though it trembled. "She always said you were the patient one." Tom chuckled softly. Guess she was wrong about that. They shared a quiet laugh, the sound fragile but real. For a few moments, the kitchen felt safe, like the world hadn't tilted just yet. As she packed her bag again, Tom walked her to the truck. "You'll be okay getting home?" "Yeah, I'll take the long way back," she said, slipping on her headphones. "Makes it look like I was just at the park." He nodded. "Smart girl." She hesitated before opening the door. "Grandpa?" "Yeah? You're not giving up, are you?" His eyes met hers, steady as carved oak. "I built that house with my hands," he said quietly, "and I'll see this through with them too." Ella smiled through her worry, then climbed in and left, the sound of her tires fading down the road. Inside, Tom returned to the table. The teacup still held a faint ring of warmth. He looked at it for a long while, then exhaled through his nose, slow and sure. He reached into his pocket and unfolded the deed again, reading his own name on the page, not for comfort, but for clarity. Across town, in the same hour, Brian sat at his laptop in the living room, eyes bright with ambition. The screen glowed with a real estate listing form, private seller mode. The title read, "Charming Family, Home with Modern Potential." He uploaded photos, adjusted the asking price, and clicked Save Draft. Outside, the last of the sunlight faded, the world dimming into quiet tension. The trap was tightening, just as Tom had expected. He didn't need to rush. Builders knew timing. He would wait for the right moment to strike, the one when silence turned into justice. It was a gray morning, heavy with the kind of quiet that comes before a decision. Tom sat at Clara's kitchen table, the smell of brewed coffee mixing with the faint scent of old paper. Clara stood by the counter, her phone pressed to her ear, speaking in low, clipped tones. "Yes, George, today if you can," she said. "It's urgent." When she hung up, she turned to Tom. "He's coming over. 10 minutes. Tom nodded, silent, steady. He had learned long ago that truth doesn't need panic to be powerful. Still, the waiting gnawed at the edges of his patience. His hands were folded on the table, calloused fingers tracing slow circles on the wood. Outside, a car pulled into the driveway. Moments later, the front door opened, and George Harlan stepped in, mid-60s, gray hair, briefcase under one arm, and an air of quiet authority that filled the room. "Thomas," he greeted warmly, shaking his hand, "Clara tells me you've had some trouble." "Trouble's one word for it," Tom said, offering a tired smile. "My son thinks he owns what he didn't build." George set his briefcase on the table, clicking it open with a crisp snap. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Clara handed him the folder, the copy of the deed, the trust documents, the notarized pages Brian had convinced Tom to sign. George adjusted his glasses, flipping through the papers with the precision of a man who had seen every kind of deception the world could offer. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of paper and the steady tick of the kitchen clock. Finally, George looked up. He tried to transfer ownership, all right, but he didn't finish it. Tom met his gaze. "Meaning?" "Meaning," George said, tapping the page with his pen, "the trust still rules. The property remains under Thomas Miller Revocable Living Trust. Until a legal amendment is processed, filed, and verified with the county, no transfer is valid. Clara exhaled sharply. So he doesn't own it. Not even close, George said. Right now, all he's got is a signed intent form. No legal standing. He can't sell, can't refinance, can't even list it properly. You, Thomas, are still the owner. The words hung in the air like the first crack of dawn after a long night. Tom didn't speak at first. His eyes drifted to the window where the faint winter light shimmered on the glass. The tightness in his chest loosened slightly, replaced by something colder, not relief, but clarity. So, after all that, he said quietly, the house never really left my hands. George smiled faintly. Paper can fool a man for a while, but law remembers what's written first. Clara was already moving toward her phone. We could call the registry office now, she said. Or better yet, show up in person. We can shut this down before they go any further. But Tom shook his head, slow, deliberate. No, Clara stopped mid-step. No? Not yet, he said. Her brows drew together. Tom, you could stop him today. You could walk back in there, show them the truth, end this. He looked up at her, calm and unreadable. And what would that teach him? That he can always talk his way out before the consequences land. George studied him with quiet respect. You're planning to let him hang himself with his own rope. Tom's lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smile. Something like that. Clara's frustration softened into understanding. She had known Tom too long to mistake patience for passivity. You want him to feel safe, she said slowly, to think he's won. Tom nodded. Let him taste victory, let him brag. When the fall comes, I want him to feel it. Not just lose a house, but understand what he tried to take. George closed the folder and slid it back across the table. Then you hold the stronger hand, but you'll need evidence. Copies, dates, signatures. Build your case quietly. Tom took the folder, his fingers brushing the paper like a craftsman examining his tools. I've been building my whole life, he said. This time, I'll build justice. The room fell silent again. Outside, the clouds shifted, letting a narrow beam of sunlight spill through the window and stretch across the table. It landed on Tom's hands, steady, patient, and certain. Clara spoke softly, almost to herself. Then, let him believe the storm's past. Tom nodded once, his eyes fixed on the window. Because it's only just beginning. The late morning sun glared against the white siding of the Miller house as Samantha paced across the front lawn, her heels sinking slightly into the soft ground. A photographer followed her with a bulky camera, adjusting lenses and angles, while a young realtor assistant positioned throw pillows in the living room window. Make sure you get the staircase in the shot, Samantha said, her voice light but clipped. It's rustic vintage. Buyers love that word. From the sidewalk, the old maple trees cast shadows that swayed gently across the house's face, the same trees Tom had planted the year Brian was born. Now, under Samantha's careful staging, the home looked polished, hollow, like a memory dressed up for sale. Inside, she moved with the precision of a curator, rearranging furniture, setting vases just so, fluffing cushions she'd chosen to match a palette of modern warmth. To her, it was presentation. To Tom, when he'd later see the pictures, it would feel like erasure. Miles away, in Clara's small living room, Tom sat at her desk, watching the digital reflection of his life being turned into a listing. Ella had sent him the link discreetly that morning, her message brief. They posted the house. Tom clicked the attachment. The page loaded slowly, every second heavier than the last. Then there it was, the front of his home, gleaming in artificial light, captioned in cheerful font, charming family home with modern potential, recently updated ownership structure, move-in ready. His jaw tightened at those words, updated ownership structure. The phrasing was careful, deceitful, designed to sound legitimate. He scrolled down, studying every detail with the precision of a craftsman checking his measurements. Listing date, February 12th. Property ID, Dimar 20457, PA. Agent, Samantha Miller, co-owner. He took Faust, Notes in a small leather-bound pad, the same one he'd once used to log construction estimates. His handwriting was deliberate, unhurried. This wasn't rage. It was record-keeping. Clara entered the room with 2 mugs of coffee and leaned over his shoulder. Her eyes darkened when she saw the screen. "They actually did it," she said. "They really listed it." Tom nodded once. "They're confident," he said quietly. "That's good." "Good?" she repeated, incredulous. "The higher they climb, the harder the fall." He clicked through the gallery, the kitchen, the living room, even his workshop, scrubbed and staged to look impersonal. Strangers had walked through his life, touching the same banister he'd carved by hand. A man in one of the photos leaned casually against the doorway, where Evelyn used to hang her apron. Clara watched him closely. "You want me to contact George?" "Not yet," he said. "They're still setting the bait." She hesitated. "Tom, I know what you're doing, but you're torturing yourself." He looked up, calm but firm. "This isn't torture. This is timing." On his phone, another message from Ella appeared, a series of screenshots. One showed Samantha's email to the realtor confirming an open house date. Another captured a text from Brian. "List it quietly for now. Dad's out of the picture." He saved each image carefully into a folder labeled Evidence, Miller House. "Smart girl," Clara said softly, "just like her grandmother." Tom smiled faintly. Ella knows what truth looks like, even when adults try to hide it. He turned back to the screen, his face illuminated by the glow. The house looked beautiful, almost too perfect. It wasn't his anymore, not physically, but he knew better. Ownership wasn't in walls or locks. It was in what was written, filed, signed, and the law still bore his name. Clara sat beside him, flipping open her notebook. "Then we'll keep collecting. Screenshots, dates, messages. When it's all in place, we'll move." Tom nodded slowly. "Let them sign the deal. Let the ink dry. When they think it's done, that's when the real work begins." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes. Tom's gaze stayed on the screen, on the house he'd built, now photographed and sold in spirit, but not in truth. He leaned back, voice barely above a whisper. "Silence can be louder than shouting," he said, "and mine's about to echo." Saturday came wrapped in sunlight, the kind that made everything look better than it really was. Balloons fluttered from the mailbox, tied in cheerful blue and white, a cheap disguise for betrayal. A sleek sign stood at the end of the driveway, "Open House, hosted by Samantha Miller." Beneath it, smaller print read, "By appointment only," though the door had been open all morning. Tom parked a block away, cutting the engine and sitting for a moment in silence. Through the windshield, he could see cars already lining the street, people walking up the drive with polite smiles and curious eyes. He rested his hands on the steering wheel, feeling the calluses under his fingers, the same hands that had built that porch, poured that foundation, sealed that roof. Every inch of the house carried his fingerprints. He got out slowly, straightened his jacket, and began walking toward the property like a man visiting a ghost. Inside, the living room buzzed with chatter and footsteps. Samantha moved among the crowd with a glass of sparkling water, her voice pitched to Carrie. "We just love the natural light in here," she said sweetly to a couple admiring the fireplace. "It's such a warm, family-oriented space. My husband's father originally built the house decades ago, but we've really brought it into the modern age." Tom stepped through the open door unnoticed at first. The realtor, a young man in a crisp suit, smiled mechanically. "Welcome. Feel free to look around. It's a beautiful property." Tom nodded once. "I know," he said quietly. He moved through the house slowly, his boots silent on the refinished floors. Every corner told a story only he could read. The hairline mark on the doorway, where Brian had measured his height at age 10. The small groove in the banister from years of Evelyn's hand brushing past. The new paint couldn't cover the memories, it only muted them. Samantha's voice carried again. "We've updated nearly everything. Floors, fixtures, energy-efficient lighting. We're expecting multiple offers by Monday." She laughed lightly, the sound hollow as glass. Tom ran his hand along the wall, feeling the smooth plaster beneath the fresh coat. His craftsmanship was still there, buried under layers of someone else's idea of progress. In the kitchen, the scent of lemon cleaner fought with a faint trace of sawdust that would never leave. He stood in the center of the room, surrounded by strangers commenting on the classic charm, and for a moment, time folded. He could see Evelyn standing by the stove, humming the same song he used to whistle. "Dad?" The voice snapped him back. Brian stood near the entryway, frozen mid-step, eyes wide. The color drained from his face. Tom turned, expression calm, almost gentle. "Brian," he said, like greeting an old acquaintance. "What are you doing here?" Brian's voice wavered, just slightly. Tom looked around, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "Just checking out the house you threw me out of." His tone was quiet, conversational, but the words landed like a hammer on stone. The room shifted. A few guests glanced over, sensing tension. Samantha hurried toward them, smile plastered in place. "Tom," she said smoothly, "we weren't expecting you today." "I gathered that," Tom replied, his eyes never leaving Brian's. Samantha's smile twitched. "We're showing the property. You really shouldn't be here right now. It could confuse potential buyers." Tom nodded slightly. "Wouldn't want to confuse anyone. They should know exactly what kind of family they're buying from." A flicker of panic crossed her face. "That's enough," she hissed under her breath, stepping closer. "You're making a scene." He looked down at her hand, clutching his arm, then back up with a calm so controlled it was frightening. "A scene," he said softly, "would involve shouting. I don't shout." He gently removed her hand and turned back toward the door. The chatter in the room had quieted now, tension humming like static. Brian stood still, sweat glistening at his temple. As Tom reached the doorway, he paused and glanced back once more. "You did good work cleaning it up," he said, almost made it look like it was never mine. Then he stepped outside, the air cooler, sharper. Behind him, the conversations resumed in cautious whispers. Brian followed him halfway onto the porch, his voice low, pleading. "Dad, wait." Tom stopped without turning. "You said I didn't belong here," he said quietly. "Now I see you were half right. I don't belong in the house anymore. But the house still belongs to me." Brian's lips parted, but no words came. Tom descended the steps slowly, each footfall deliberate. He didn't look back again. Inside, Samantha forced another brittle smile for the guests, her knuckles white around her glass. The photographer hesitated before raising his camera again. Outside, Tom reached his truck, opened the door, and sat for a long time with the engine off. Through the window, he could see Brian standing in the doorway, pale and motionless. For the first time since the betrayal began, it wasn't Tom who looked haunted. The email hit Brian's inbox just before noon. The subject line glowed like a promise. Formal offer, 417 Oakwood Drive. He opened it instantly, eyes racing through the numbers. 6 figures. More money than he'd ever seen attached to his name. The buyer, a young tech couple from Pittsburgh, had written, "We're ready to move forward immediately. Cash offer, no contingencies." Brian exhaled, leaning back in his chair. His pulse drummed fast, greedy. This was it. The payday that would make every argument, every lie, worth it. He swiveled towards Samantha, who was perched on the couch with her tablet. "They're offering full price," he said, barely containing his grin. "Cash." She looked up, her smile widening. "You're kidding." "Nope. They want it this week." He grinned, tapping the screen. "All we have to do is sign the acceptance and send it back." Samantha crossed her legs, calculating. "Then do it. Let's close before anyone else jumps in." He hesitated. "There's one catch. The system still lists Dad as a co-owner on the trust file. The agent said they just need his digital approval before processing." Her smile faltered for half a heartbeat, then returned, sharper. "Then give them what they need." Brian's throat tightened slightly. "You mean..." Samantha leaned closer. "You have his old email, don't you? You know his password. You said he never changed it." "Still feels risky." "Brian," she said softly, her hand resting on his arm, "this house is already ours. He signed it over. You're not stealing. You're just finalizing what's already done. Those words, already ours, were enough. Brian turned back to the computer. The cursor blinked beside a blank signature line. He hesitated for 3 seconds, then began typing. Thomas A. Miller. The digital ink appeared neat, perfect, damning. He clicked submit. The confirmation tone chimed through the speakers, a sound that would echo far louder than he realized. Across town, in Clara's office, a different tone sounded, her email alert. She glanced at the monitor, frowning as a new property notice appeared from the county registry. That's strange, she murmured. Tom, sitting across from her with a mug of coffee, looked up. What is it? She clicked the notice open, eyes narrowing. Your property just generated a transactional record. Someone filed an acceptance offer under your trust. Tom set the mug down carefully. Already? Yes, she said, scrolling, but the file ID shows a forged signature. Look here. The system shows it was submitted from an IP address tied to Brian's business account. Tom's face didn't change. So he finally did it. Clara turned the screen toward him, her voice sharp. He just committed forgery on a registered trust property. That's not just unethical, that's a felony. Tom leaned forward slightly, scanning the document. The buyers' names were listed, the offer date stamped in digital ink. Every line confirmed what he already knew deep down. Brian hadn't just crossed a line, he'd burned the bridge behind him. Clara reached for the phone. I can call the county registrar right now, have the transaction frozen within the hour. Tom nodded once. Do it. As she spoke to the clerk, her voice professional and crisp, Tom stared out the office window. The winter sunlight glinted off the courthouse roof across the street. He could hear Clara confirming the freeze order, her words calm, but laced with victory. When she hung up, she smiled for the first time in days, not out of joy, but out of justice. It's locked, she said. No money can move, no title can transfer. The system flagged the forgery instantly. Tom nodded again, expression unreadable. Clara leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. Now he's crossed into felony territory. For a long moment, Tom didn't reply. He just sat there, letting the words settle, letting the weight of them breathe. Then he looked at her. Steady, calm, the builder in him already seeing the structure of what came next. Then, tomorrow, he said softly, it's my house again. The way he said it wasn't boastful or triumphant. It was measured, the tone of a man who had waited long enough to strike with precision. Outside, the sun slid lower, the sky turning amber over the small town streets. Clara closed the file, her hands trembling slightly with adrenaline. You're really going through with it, aren't you? Tom rose slowly, the chair creaking behind him. He built this with lies, he said. I'll take it back with the truth. As he stepped out into the fading light, the courthouse bell began to ring, each note sharp and final. The sound followed him down the street like an omen, steady, unhurried, and sure. Snow whispered against the windows like soft applause, steady and relentless. The small heater in Clara's guest room hummed in the corner, fighting to keep the chill away. On the desk beside him, Tom worked by lamplight, his carving knife glinting in slow rhythm. Each cut into the block of cedar wood released a faint scent of earth and memory. He was shaping wings now, small, delicate, imperfect, a wooden angel. Evelyn had loved angels. Christmas Eve, his first one alone in 50 years. He paused for a moment, studying the figure under his hands. The angel's face was rough but kind, just like his late wife's had been when she smiled through a hard day. He smoothed the edge of its halo with his thumb and whispered, "Almost done, Evie." The sound of his own voice in the quiet felt foreign. Outside, the snow deepened. Clara had left earlier to visit her sister, insisting he come along, but Tom had declined. He needed the stillness. The silence had its own language, one he was starting to understand again. A soft knock came at the door. He frowned, glancing at the clock. Nearly 7. He wasn't expecting anyone. When he opened the door, a gust of cold air swept in, carrying with it the sight of a familiar figure bundled in a red scarf. "Ella?" She smiled shyly, snowflakes caught in her hair. "Merry Christmas, Grandpa." He stepped aside, ushering her in quickly. "You shouldn't be out in this weather." "I told Mom I was going to a friend's house," she said, setting a wrapped parcel on the table. "I wanted to see you." Tom's chest tightened. "You always did know how to make an old man's night." She glanced at the carving on the desk. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Just something to keep my hands busy," he said softly. "Wood listens better than people sometimes." Ella smiled faintly, then pushed the small parcel toward him. "Open it." Inside was a leather-bound folder tied with a ribbon. He opened it slowly, her art portfolio. The first page showed a sketch of the house, drawn from memory, each window shaded with care. Another page held a charcoal portrait of him at his workbench, the lines deep and precise. "I wanted you to have it," she said, voice small, "for when you go back home." Tom swallowed hard, tracing the lines with a trembling finger. "Ella, this is—" She stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him before he could finish. "You're still our heart," she said quietly against his chest. "Even if they forget sometimes." He hugged her tightly, the smell of snow and pine filling the space between them. His eyes burned, but he let the tears fall this time. "You got your grandmother's gift," he said, voice breaking, "seeing beauty where others don't." They sat together for a while, sipping cocoa Clara had left on the stove. The clock ticked softly, marking time in gentle beats. Across town, the laughter was louder. The Miller house glowed with party lights strung across the porch, the hum of conversation spilling into the cold night. Brian stood at the center of the room, drink in hand, surrounded by colleagues and neighbors. "Closings next week," he announced proudly, finally cashing in on that old place. Dad would have wanted it this way, to mean something again. Samantha smiled too brightly. "To new beginnings," she said, clinking her glass against his. The crowd cheered, none of them knowing how hollow the celebration really was. Meanwhile, in Clara's study, the soft tap of keys broke the night's stillness. She sat wrapped in a shawl, her glasses reflecting the glow of the computer screen. On it, the compiled file of evidence, digital forgery, registry records, property fraud, waited as a single attachment. She hovered the mouse over send. Tom's voice from earlier echoed in her mind. "Tomorrow, it's my house again." She clicked. The email zipped through cyberspace toward the district attorney's office, time-stamped 11:58 p.m. on December 24th. Back in the guest room, Tom placed the wooden angel on the windowsill, its tiny wings catching the glow of the streetlight outside. "Watch over them," he murmured, "even the ones who've lost their way." Ella smiled faintly beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. The clock struck midnight, each chime reverberating through the quiet house. Somewhere across town, Brian's laughter faltered for a moment, as if the sound had reached him too, an unseen shift, the first tremor of consequence. Tom didn't know it yet, but the clock had just marked more than the start of Christmas. It had marked the turning point, the moment justice began to breathe. Christmas morning dawned bright and sharp, the snow glinting like shards of glass under the pale sun. Inside the Miller house, wrapping paper still littered the living room floor from the night before, remnants of a celebration that had stretched late into laughter and wine. Brian stirred awake to the sound of footsteps on the porch, heavy, deliberate. For a moment, he thought it was a delivery, another bottle of champagne from one of his colleagues. Then came the knock, 3 firm raps, steady and official. Samantha appeared, at the top of the stairs, hair tangled, eyes squinting. "Brian?" she called. "Who's at the door?" He pulled on his robe, annoyed, and opened it. 2 uniformed officers stood on the porch, their breath fogging in the cold. Behind them, a black sedan idled quietly at the curb. The taller officer spoke first. "Mr. Brian Miller?" Brian's shoulders stiffened. "Yeah, that's me." "I'm Officer Davis with the county sheriff's office," the man said, holding out an envelope. "You're being served notice of investigation regarding a potential deed forgery under the Miller family trust." For a moment, Brian didn't understand the words. They sounded distant, hollow, as though they were being said through water. "A what?" An investigation, the officer repeated. You'll need to appear for questioning. All financial transactions related to 417 Oakwood Drive have been frozen pending review. Samantha was halfway down the stairs now, her robe trailing behind her. What is this? She demanded. The officer handed over the papers. Official notice, ma'am. You'll find the details inside. Her eyes darted across the first page. Legal jargon, case numbers, a seal from the district attorney's office. The color drained from her face. This has to be a mistake, she said weakly. Brian's voice rose, thin with panic. There's no mistake. My father signed those papers himself. I have his digital signature, the officer interrupted. Yes, sir, that's the issue. The registry confirmed it was submitted from your business IP address. You'll have your chance to explain it. The second officer shifted, expression neutral but heavy with awareness. We just need you to acknowledge receipt of the notice. Brian hesitated, his hand hovering over the clipboard. When he finally scrawled his name, his signature came out shaky, uneven. The officer nodded, took back the clipboard, and stepped off the porch. You'll be contacted soon by the DA's office. They turned and walked away, leaving the front door wide open, the winter air pouring in like judgment. Samantha's lips trembled. Brian, what did you do? He stared at the papers in his hand, the black ink blurring as his heartbeat roared in his ears. It wasn't. I needed to finish the sale. He was never going to let go. She sank onto the bottom stair, staring at nothing. You forged his name. It wasn't forgery, he snapped. It was fixing a mistake. But even as he said it, the words tasted like lies. He turned, grabbing his phone from the table, dialing fast. The screen lit with the name he didn't want to see but couldn't avoid. Dad. The line rang once, twice. Then voicemail. He tried again. Nothing. Across the hall, a door creaked open. Ella peeked out, her face pale but alert. She had heard everything. When Brian met her gaze, she stepped back silently into her room and shut the door. Inside, her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. Her thumbs typed quickly. It's happening. She hit send. Across town, in Clara's cozy kitchen, Tom sat at the small table by the window. A thin curl of steam rose from his coffee mug, the morning light catching the rim. His phone buzzed once beside it. He glanced at the message, then set it face down without replying. Clara entered from the hallway, still in her robe, hair tousled from sleep. You heard? She asked softly. Tom nodded, a quiet hum of acknowledgement in his throat. They came to him this morning, he said. She poured herself coffee, watching him over the rim of her cup. Do you feel any better? He thought about it, eyes distant. Better's not the word, he said finally. Some things don't deserve comfort, only balance. Outside, a small flock of sparrows burst from the trees, their movement sudden, scattered, as if the world itself had just shifted slightly toward equilibrium. Clara sat across from him, studying the calm on his face. You always were patient, she said. He smiled faintly, gaze still fixed on the window. Sometimes justice doesn't need noise. The words hung between them, quiet and heavy, like the final brushstroke on a long painted canvas. In the distance, faint church bells began to ring, a reminder that Christmas Day was still unfolding. But for Brian Miller, the celebration was over. Tom took a slow sip of coffee, the warmth grounding him as the snow outside began to fall again, soft and sure. The storm had come full circle, and for the first time in months, he let himself feel the peace that follows consequence. The storm that had started with a knock on the door didn't end there. By Monday morning, the first cracks in Brian's perfect world began to spread, quiet, invisible, and unstoppable. He was halfway through his coffee when his phone buzzed with a notification from the bank. Transaction delayed, verification required. He frowned, refreshing the screen. Then another message appeared. Funds on hold, pending investigation. Within seconds, every account linked to the Oakwood property showed the same red warning banner. Frozen. Must be a glitch, he muttered, logging into the mortgage app. It refused to load. The brokerage site timed out. Even his business card, the one tied to his real estate firm, declined when he tried to pay for gas on the way to work. By the time he reached his office, his jaw was clenched tight enough to ache. His assistant, nervous and pale, handed him a stack of printouts. "The buyer's agent called," she said carefully. "They're pulling their offer." He blinked. "What? Why?" "They said the county flagged the title. Something about legal uncertainty. They don't want to get tied up in litigation." Brian dropped into his chair, staring at the papers. The buyer's letter was polite, almost apologetic. "We regret to withdraw due to pending legal complications regarding ownership." He read it twice, each word landing like a small, precise blow. The six-figure dream had vanished overnight. At home, Samantha was pacing the kitchen when he arrived, her expression carved in stone. "Do you have any idea what's happening?" she demanded the second he stepped through the door. "I just got off the phone with the mortgage broker. They're freezing the pre-approval. They said your accounts are under review." "It's temporary," he said quickly, "just until they sort through the paperwork." She crossed her arms. "Paperwork? Or forgery?" The word hit him like a slap. "Don't start that," he snapped. "You were part of this too. You wanted that house sold as much as I did." "I didn't tell you to fake your father's signature," she shot back. Her voice cracked, anger folding into panic. "God, Brian, what were you thinking? You tried to play smart with a lawyer's son." He froze, staring at her. "What did you say?" "You heard me," she said bitterly. "Clara's not just some friend of your dad's. She's the late wife's best friend, and an attorney. You think she wouldn't notice a fake? You practically handed her the rope." Brian turned away, gripping the back of a chair so hard his knuckles went white. The house, the deal, the image he'd built of himself, all of it was crumbling faster than he could contain it. From upstairs, there was a faint creak, the sound of a door opening. Ella had been home early from school. She'd heard everything. She stood at the top of the stairs, silent, tears stinging her eyes. Her father's voice drifted up, angrier now. "You think I did this for me? I was securing our future. That house was rotting with him in it." Samantha's reply came like a dagger. "You weren't saving the family, Brian. You were saving your pride." Ella backed away slowly, her breath shaking. The words sliced deeper than any shouting match. For the first time, she saw her father not as misguided, but as lost. Downstairs, a door slammed. Brian stormed into his office, pulling drawers open, searching for something he couldn't name. An answer, maybe, or a lifeline. But the only thing staring back was the printed deed copy, his father's name still etched clean and unshaken. The next morning, another email arrived. This one from the county office, confirming the freeze on the property sale and the notice of pending litigation. The subject line was sterile, bureaucratic, but to Brian, it read like a death sentence. Across town, Tom sat in Clara's kitchen again, reading the same notice on her laptop. His face didn't move, but his eyes glimmered faintly in the winter light. Clara handed him the mug of coffee. "Everything's locked down. He can't move a dollar without raising suspicion." Tom nodded, setting the cup down gently. "Good," he said. "Now we let him sit with it. The silence, the waiting, the wait." He looked toward the window, the frost tracing thin patterns against the glass. "I've built houses that could stand against storms," he murmured. "Now I've built one that can bring them." The faintest trace of a smile touched his lips, not of triumph, but of certainty. The foundations of justice were holding steady. The next move would end it. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and polished floors, a scent that carried both authority and finality. Tom Miller sat quietly on the wooden bench outside courtroom 3B, his hands resting on his cane. Beside him, Clara flipped through a neatly tabbed binder, her glasses low on her nose. She was composed, professional, but her fingers betrayed a faint tremor of restrained fury. "Ready?" she asked softly. Tom nodded once. "Been ready a long time," he said. When the bailiff opened the door, they stepped inside. The room was cold, lined with solemn faces and oak-paneled walls. At the front, the judge adjusted his robe and glanced over the docket. The opposing side, Brian and his attorney, were already seated. Brian looked smaller somehow, his expensive suit doing little to hide the exhaustion beneath his eyes. The clerk called the case. Miller versus Miller, trust property dispute. Tom's name echoed through the chamber, grounding him. For months, his life had been reduced to whispers, paperwork, and humiliation. Now, finally, the truth had its stage. Clara rose, her voice firm but respectful. Your Honor, the defense will demonstrate that Mr. Brian Miller engaged in fraudulent activity involving forged digital signatures on property documents belonging to the Thomas Miller Revocable Living Trust. The original ownership has never been legally transferred. Brian's lawyer, a man too smooth for his own good, stood. Your Honor, my client maintains this was a misunderstanding. Mr. Miller Sr. intended to grant co-ownership to his son, and any confusion in the filing process was purely administrative. The judge, an older man with tired eyes, leaned forward. Administrative confusion does not explain a forged digital signature. Continue. Clara clicked the remote, and the screen beside the bench lit up. Exhibit A, she said. The original trust file, signed, notarized, and registered, under Mr. Thomas Miller's name. Exhibit B, the transfer document, submitted months later from Mr. Brian Miller's personal IP address. Not only is it incomplete, it was digitally signed in a manner inconsistent with the elder Mr. Miller's previous legal filings. Brian shifted in his seat, his knuckles white on the table. His lawyer whispered something, but Brian shook his head sharply. The judge examined the pages before him, his brow furrowing deeper with each one. Finally, he set the papers down and looked directly at Brian. Did you or did you not sign your father's name electronically without his authorization? Brian's throat moved, but no sound came. I thought he meant for me to handle it, he stammered. He said I should take responsibility. Tom's voice, calm and level, broke the tension. Responsibility isn't theft, son. It's honesty when no one's watching. Brian looked away, his face draining of color. The judge cleared his throat. The record speaks for itself. The trust remains legally intact. Ownership of the property at 417 Oakwood Drive is hereby reaffirmed under the sole name of Thomas Miller. The sound of the gavel striking wood filled the room, sharp, final, almost sacred. For a moment, no one moved. Clara exhaled slowly, the smallest smile flickering at the corner of her mouth. Tom sat still, absorbing the weight of it. Not joy, not triumph, but release. Brian's lawyer packed up quickly, muttering something about appeals. But Brian didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the polished floor, the sound of the gavel still echoing in his ears. The foundation of his pride had finally collapsed. Tom rose, his movements deliberate, steady. As he reached the aisle, he paused beside his son. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke the words Brian had once thrown at him. You said I didn't belong there, he said quietly. Then let's see whose home it really was. Brian didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor. Clara joined Tom at the door, her briefcase in hand. Outside, sunlight spilled through the tall windows, sharp and clean. Tom stopped just long enough to glance back at the emptying courtroom. Justice, he thought, doesn't always feel light. Sometimes it settles on your shoulders like the weight of the years it took to earn it. As the heavy doors closed behind him, Clara turned to him with a nod. It's over, she said. Tom's gaze stayed forward. No, he murmured. It's only even. The morning came cool and still, a sky of dull silver hanging low over Oakwood Drive. The sheriff's cruiser pulled quietly into the driveway, just after 8. No sirens, no commotion, just authority arriving with purpose. A deputy stepped out first, clipboard in hand, and exchanged a few quiet words with the sheriff before walking to the porch. Through the front window, movement. Samantha appeared, wrapped in a robe, her hair half done, her expression tight with disbelief. Brian followed a moment later, pale, unshaven, wearing yesterday's shirt. Mr. Miller, the sheriff said, his tone professional, but not unkind. We're here to enforce the court's eviction order. You've been notified. Samantha's voice broke sharp through the morning air. This is ridiculous. We're family. You can't just throw us out like criminals. The sheriff remained calm. Ma'am, the court order is clear. You have until noon to vacate. The property is being returned to its rightful owner." Her mouth opened again, ready to argue, but Brian placed a hand on her arm. His voice came low, hollow. "Don't. It's done." A moving truck idled at the curb, its driver waiting for instruction. One by one, boxes began to appear on the lawn, labeled, stacked, silent witnesses to the irony of it all. From the end of the street, an old blue pickup rolled into view. Tom parked across from the house and sat there for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel. The last time he'd stood here, his life had been packed into garbage bags. Today, his name had returned to the deed. Clara stepped out from the passenger side, dressed in a dark coat, her breath visible in the cold. "You ready?" she asked softly. Tom nodded once. "As I'll ever be." They crossed the street together. The sheriff looked up as they approached, giving a respectful nod. "Mr. Miller," he said, "all in order." Tom thanked him quietly. His gaze shifted to the boxes by the curb. Kitchen, living room, office. The handwriting was Brian's, the same neat block letters that once labeled his childhood toys in the attic. Brian looked up from the porch, his face unreadable. "You didn't waste any time," he said bitterly. Tom's voice was calm. "Neither did you, when it was my things on the curb." Samantha turned away, muttering under her breath, fury trembling just beneath the surface. "This is cruel," she hissed. "You're humiliating us." Tom met her eyes. "Humiliation is what you did when you changed the locks." She had no reply. She brushed past Brian, climbed into her car, and slammed the door. The tires spun against the asphalt as she sped away, leaving behind the smell of exhaust and resentment. For a long moment, Brian didn't move. The only sounds were the soft wind and the faint creak of the old maple branches overhead. Then he bent, lifted one of the boxes, and set it gently beside the others. Ella appeared at the edge of the yard, clutching her sketchbook against her chest. Her eyes were red, but when she saw her grandfather, she smiled. A small, proud smile that warmed the cold morning. Tom opened his arms, and she ran to him. The hug was tight, unguarded. "You did it," she whispered. He shook his head slightly. "We did." When they pulled apart, he looked toward the open door of the house. The threshold seemed both familiar and foreign, like the first step into a memory. Slowly, he climbed the porch steps, his old key resting in his palm. The sheriff watched quietly as Tom slid it into the lock. The same lock Brian had replaced months ago. It turned smoothly this time. The door swung open with a gentle groan. Inside, the house smelled of cedar, faint paint, and ghosts of a life reclaimed. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. Every creak of the floorboards, every echo of space, whispered welcome. Tom took a slow step inside. His eyes moved across the living room. The fireplace he'd built stone by stone, the staircase that still held his careful craftsmanship. The air felt lighter, as if the walls themselves recognized him. Behind him, Clara stood in the doorway, her expression softening. "Welcome home," she said quietly. He turned to her, a faint smile touching his face. "Home," he repeated, as though testing the word after a long absence. Ella joined them, stepping just inside the door. The three of them stood together, framed by morning light and silence, a still image of justice fulfilled. But beneath the peace, a quiet weight lingered. Tom looked back once more at the street, where Brian stood beside his boxes, staring down at the ground. The wind lifted the corner of one box flap, rattling it softly. Tom didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The reckoning had arrived, but forgiveness, he knew, would take its own time. He closed the door gently behind them. The latch clicked into place, not as an ending, but as the first sound of something rebuilt. The winter thaw came slow that year, melting the snow from the eaves one patient drip at a time. Inside the Miller house, warmth had returned, not just from the newly fixed furnace, but from something deeper, something lighter. The echo of emptiness that had haunted the rooms was gone, replaced by the steady rhythm of rebuilding. Tom stood in the hallway, sleeves rolled up, brush in hand, painting over the scuffed walls Brian had left behind. The color was soft cream, the same shade Evelyn had chosen decades ago. Every stroke brought a quiet satisfaction. Not anger, not revenge, but peace, reclaiming its ground. Ella hummed in the background, perched on a small ladder near the window, dabbing paint carefully along the trim. A streak of white marked her cheek, but she didn't notice. "You missed a spot," Tom teased, stepping back to inspect her work. She grinned. "Artistic choice." He laughed, a full, easy sound that filled the house like sunlight. It had been months since that kind of laughter had lived here, and even the walls seemed to hold it close. By noon, they moved to the living room, laying down new planks of oak to replace the warped ones. The hammer in Tom's hand felt right again, balanced, steady. He showed Ella how to measure twice before cutting, just as he had, once shown Brian. "Remember," he said, guiding her hand, "you don't rush a cut. Wood teaches you patience." She nodded, eyes bright, repeating the motion with care. Together they worked in unspoken rhythm, the way family should, each swing of the hammer echoing both loss and renewal. When they broke for lunch, the smell of soup simmered from the stove. Clara had stopped by earlier, bringing groceries and her familiar quiet energy. She returned now with coffee, stepping carefully across the newly sanded floors. "Looks like progress," she said, smiling as she handed Tom his mug. He nodded, taking a slow sip. "It's getting there. Feels strange, though, building the same walls twice." "Not strange," Clara replied softly, "just necessary." They shared a look that said more than words could. He understood what she meant. Restoration wasn't about undoing what was broken, but about rebuilding something stronger in its place. After lunch, Ella unpacked an old shoebox filled with photos, the ones Brian had taken down when he started modernizing. She spread them across the table carefully, the edges curled with age. "Where should these go?" she asked. Tom took one in his hand, a picture of Evelyn standing in the garden laughing, her hair caught in the wind. "Right back where they belong," he said. Together they moved from room to room, rehanging memories. Evelyn's photo over the fireplace, Brian's childhood drawing in the hallway, even an old family portrait by the stairwell, a reminder that the story hadn't always been broken. Each nail he drove into the wall felt like an act of reclamation. The sound, that crisp metallic tap-tap, echoed through the rooms like a heartbeat. By evening, the house had changed. It wasn't new and it wasn't perfect, but it felt alive again. Paint still drying, tools scattered on the floor, laughter mingling with the smell of fresh wood, the kind of mess that only comes from creation. Neighbors began to stop by, drawn by curiosity and quiet respect. Mrs. Jenkins brought pie. The Walker brothers offered to help with the gutters. Each visitor said the same thing. "We're glad you're back, Tom." He always smiled modestly, shaking his head. "It was never about the house," he said each time. "It was about truth." That line spread through the neighborhood like gospel, whispered in admiration. Even those who had once doubted him spoke of it, how a man could lose everything and still rebuild without bitterness. As the sun dipped low, Tom and Clara stood in the doorway, watching Ella finish her last brushstroke near the window. The golden light caught the dust in the air, turning it to glitter. "You know," Clara said softly, "you could have just taken your victory and walked away. Let someone else do the fixing." Tom smiled faintly. "I couldn't," he said. "The fixing's the best part. It's where the hurt turns into something useful." She nodded, her expression tender. "Then you didn't just get your house back," she said. "You got your legacy back." He looked around the room, the marks of new work blending with old craftsmanship, the hum of life returning, and he felt it too. Revenge had burned hot once, but what remained now was warmer, steadier. Ella turned from the window, her cheeks flushed from the effort. "All done," she announced proudly. Tom stepped beside her, arm resting gently on her shoulder. Together they looked at the wall, clean, bright, alive. Outside, twilight settled softly over Oakwood Drive. Inside, the light lingered just a little longer. The morning was gray and quiet. the kind of stillness that comes after too much noise. Tom sat at the kitchen table, newspaper folded neatly beside a steaming cup of coffee. The house was peaceful now, freshly painted walls, repaired floors, the faint hum of life returning to normal. Yet, beneath that peace, a silence lingered, unfinished and waiting. The knock came just after 10. Not the sharp rap of a delivery man, but softer, hesitant. Tom didn't move at first. He knew that knock before he even heard it twice. When he opened the door, Brian stood there, hands buried deep in his coat pockets, eyes downcast. For a long moment, neither spoke. The cold air filled the space between them. Brian looked older somehow, not by years but by consequence. His once slick confidence had drained away, leaving only exhaustion and something rawer. "Dad," he said quietly. Tom's voice stayed even. "Brian. Brian swallowed hard. "I didn't know if you'd even open the door." "I thought about it," Tom replied. His tone wasn't cruel, just honest. Brian nodded, staring at the porch floorboards. "I don't deserve it, but I needed to come." Tom stepped back, wordless, just enough to let him in. Brian hesitated, then crossed the threshold. The familiar creak beneath his shoes sounded like memory itself. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and coffee. Brian looked around slowly, his eyes landing on the newly rehung family photos, the same ones he had once packed away. "You fixed it up," he said quietly. Tom nodded. Didn't need fixing, just care. They stood in the middle of the living room, the weight of unspoken years pressing between them. Finally, Brian exhaled, his voice trembling. "I wanted to prove I was the man of the house." Tom looked at him, not with anger this time, but something steadier, heavier. A man doesn't prove it by stealing it. The words landed with quiet precision. Brian flinched, his eyes glistening. "I know," he said. "Every day since that hearing, I've been trying to figure out how I let it get that far. I just kept thinking if I could take over, make it mine, I'd finally be worth something." Tom's expression softened, though his silence carried more truth than words could. Brian's voice cracked. "You built this place with your hands. I built nothing but debt and excuses. I thought taking this house would make me your equal." Tom set his cup down on the counter. "You were never supposed to be my equal," he said softly. "You were supposed to be my son." For a moment, time seemed to stall. 2 generations facing the space their pride had carved between them. Then came the longest silence of all. Brian's shoulders trembled. Tom's jaw tightened. Forgiveness didn't come, but neither did rejection. Tom walked to the counter, poured a second cup of coffee, and set it on the table. "You can sit," he said. Brian blinked, startled. "After everything?" Tom motioned to the chair. "You can sit at my table," he said evenly, "but you'll earn it." Brian hesitated only a moment before sitting, his hands wrapped around the mug like it was something fragile. For the first time in months, the 2 men shared the same quiet space without bitterness, just the clinking of porcelain and the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. After a while, Ella's laughter floated faintly from upstairs, breaking the heaviness just enough. Brian looked toward the sound. "She still talks to me," he said quietly, almost surprised. Tom nodded. "She gets that from your mother, believing people can be better." Brian's eyes glistened again. "You think I can be?" Tom didn't answer right away. He just looked at him, measured and steady. "That's up to you, son," he said finally. Outside, the sun pushed weakly through the clouds, casting pale light across the kitchen. It wasn't warmth yet, but it was a start. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was rebuilding itself, one heartbeat at a time, fragile, uncertain, but alive. It started with a headline. By Monday morning, every newsstand in town carried it across the front page in bold letters. "Elderly man wins back home from son's fraud." Beneath it, a black and white photo showed Tom Miller standing on his porch, hands in his pockets, expression steady and unreadable. Clara had arranged the interview, though Tom hadn't wanted one. The young reporter from the Maple County Gazette had seemed respectful enough, asking simple questions, snapping a few photos, and promising a human interest piece. Tom hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, as he sat at his kitchen table, the paper spread open before him, he saw his story told for everyone to read. The betrayal, the eviction, the courtroom victory. His name had become a symbol, though he'd never asked for it. Across town, people were reading too. The diner where he used to take Evelyn for pie had the paper tacked to the wall. At the hardware store, a clerk nodded as Tom passed, whispering to a customer, "That's him, the man who got his house back." Public sympathy came fast, flooding through letters, cards, and calls from people he'd never met. Some sent baked goods, others just words of admiration. "You stood your ground. You give us hope." Tom appreciated it, but it sat strangely on his shoulders. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who refused to be erased. Ella, on the other hand, loved every bit of it. She brought the newspaper to school, showing her friends the article. Her art teacher even pinned it to the bulletin board. "My grandpa's amazing," she said proudly when someone asked. "He built that house with his hands and got it back with his heart." When she came home that afternoon, she found him sitting on the porch with the paper folded neatly beside him. "You made the news," she teased. Tom chuckled softly. "Seems that way." "Everyone's talking about it. Even Mrs. Jenkins said she cried when she read it." He smiled faintly, eyes still on the horizon. "Crying's easier when it's someone else's pain," he said, though his tone wasn't bitter. Ella tilted her head. "Are you mad they wrote about it?" "No," he said, "just surprised anyone still reads the truth." Inside, the phone rang again. Another well-wisher, another stranger offering congratulations. Clara picked it up, her calm voice handling the details. When she returned, she found Tom flipping through the pages of the paper again, his brow furrowed. "They're already calling it a miracle story," she said gently, "the kind people like to believe in." Tom looked up at her, half smiling. "Miracles are just hard work people don't see," he replied. Clara pulled out a chair across from him and sat down. "I know you're humble about it, Tom, but what you did, it's going to mean something to others. You gave people a story to believe in when the world feels cold." He folded the paper carefully. "Maybe, but stories fade, Clara. Houses fade too. What matters is what's left standing, when everything else settles." She watched him for a long moment, then said quietly, "Just don't hold it too tight. Fame fades, but bitterness stays." The warning landed softly but true. Tom nodded. "I'm not bitter," he said. "I'm grateful, but gratitude feels empty if you don't pass it forward." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Pass it forward?" He leaned back, the chair creaking beneath him. "When I was a kid, my father used to say, if a man's work only builds walls, he's wasted his hands. Maybe it's time I use mine for something else, something that gives back." Outside, the sound of hammers echoed faintly from a nearby renovation, young workers rebuilding another old house on the street. The rhythm of it stirred something in him, an idea taking quiet shape. Ella came back out with cocoa and 2 mugs. "Grandpa," she said brightly, "everyone wants to know what you'll do now that you have your house back." Tom took the cup, his eyes drifting toward the distant sound of the hammers. "Maybe," he said slowly. "I'll help. Other folks keep theirs." Ella smiled, not fully understanding, but sensing the warmth in his words. Clara gave a small nod. "Turning victory into purpose," she said. "That's how you make peace last." Tom didn't answer, but his gaze lingered on the light, hitting the woodwork of his porch, the same boards that had once been stripped of belonging. Now they gleamed again, solid and sure. He took a sip of his cocoa, the paper rustling softly beside him. The headline might fade tomorrow, but what came next, that he decided, would be written in deeds, not ink. The smell of sawdust returned to the Miller garage long before the tools did. For months, the space had sat silent, a graveyard of memories covered in dust. But on a quiet Saturday morning, Tom rolled up the old wooden door again, letting the light spill in across the concrete floor. He stood there for a moment, breathing in the air that smelled like work, purpose, and redemption. The bench sat where it always had, scarred and worn from decades of use. Tom brushed his hand over the surface, the grain familiar beneath his fingertips. "Back to it," he murmured to himself. Ella came running down the driveway, holding her phone like a trophy. "I made a post," she said proudly. "Grandpa's workshop, reopening for anyone who wants to learn real carpentry." Tom smiled, amused. "Social media, huh? I figured word of mouth was enough." "Not anymore," she said. "You've got to show people. Look, I already got comments. Parents asking if their kids can come by this weekend." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Guess you're the new foreman then." By afternoon, the first few kids arrived, shy boys and girls from the neighborhood, each clutching small toolboxes or notebooks. Tom greeted them with warmth, showing them how to hold a hammer, how to respect wood grain, how to measure twice and cut once. He spoke softly, but with authority, his voice carrying the calm rhythm of a man who had learned life's lessons through calluses and patience. "See," he said, guiding one boy's hands on the saw. "The trick isn't strength, it's steadiness. You let the tool do the work. Same goes for people." They laughed, listened, and learned. By the end of the day, scraps of pine and oak littered the floor, and the air buzzed with laughter and the hum of creation. The old workshop, once a place of solitude, had found its heartbeat again. That night, as Tom wiped down the tools, Ella leaned on the doorway, grinning. "You know, Grandpa, you're kind of famous now. Everyone at school's talking about Miller's workshop." He looked up, smiling faintly. "Fame fades. Remember what Clara said. But work like this, it lasts." The next week, the garage filled faster. Some kids brought friends. One father stayed to help, saying he hadn't built anything in years. Tom taught them all the same way, patiently, quietly, turning every cut and joint into a lesson about life. Then, one evening near closing time, another figure appeared in the doorway. Brian. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes scanning the space. The smell of wood and varnish brought something back, a memory of being 10 years old, standing in this same spot while his father taught him to plane a board straight. Tom didn't look up right away. "You here to watch?" he said evenly, "or to work?" Brian hesitated, then stepped forward. "To work, if you'll let me." Without another word, Tom slid a piece of sandpaper across the bench toward him. "Start with this." For a long while, they said nothing. The only sounds were the scrape of sandpaper against wood and the rhythmic creak of the stool. The silence wasn't hostile anymore. It was healing, slow and fragile. Brian finally spoke, his voice low. "I used to hate this place when I was a kid, thought it meant you cared more about wood than people." Tom paused mid-stroke, then resumed. "Houses rot when nobody cares," he said quietly. "So do hearts." Brian swallowed, his throat tight. "I know," he whispered. Tom looked at him, really looked, not at the man who'd betrayed him, but at the son who was trying, awkwardly, to return. "Then start by caring again," he said simply. When the last of the kids left and the light dimmed, they were still there, side by side, sanding the same unfinished bench. No apologies, no speeches, just shared work. The sound of 2 generations trying to rebuild something invisible, one motion at a time. For the first time in a long time, the air in the garage felt warm, not from the heater, but from the quiet truth between them. That creation, not revenge, was the real inheritance. The day ended with the kind of golden light that made everything look gentler than it was. Tom sat by the window, whittling a small block of wood while the last rays of sun filtered through the lace curtains. Outside, the world had quieted. No hammers, no laughter from the workshop, just the slow hum of a house finally at rest. He didn't hear the footsteps on the porch right away. The sound was faint, hesitant. Then came a soft thud against the welcome mat. Something small, deliberate. By the time he reached the door and opened it, the street was empty. Only a folded envelope lay in the shadow of the railing. His name was written across it in neat, careful handwriting he hadn't seen in years. Dad. Tom stood there for a long moment before picking it up. The paper was slightly damp with evening dew, the ink smudged in one corner, as if someone had gripped it too tightly before letting go. He carried it inside and sat down at his old desk, switching on the lamp. The soft yellow glow filled the room as he unfolded the letter. The writing inside was uneven, the words pressed hard into the page. Dad, I don't know how to start this without sounding like a coward, but maybe I've been one for a long time. Every time I tried to prove myself, I ended up proving the opposite. I wanted to be respected. I wanted to be you. But instead, I became the man you taught me never to be. When I forged your name, I thought I was claiming something that was mine. Now I know I was erasing everything that mattered. I took your trust, your home, and still you didn't destroy me when you could have. You gave me the space to face myself. That's worse, but also better. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I finally understand what you meant about building things right. Some mistakes you can't sand smooth, but maybe you can start over with what's left. Brian Tom's eyes lingered on the last line for a long time. His thumb brushed the edge of the paper, feeling its weight. Not much, but enough to carry the effort of someone trying to rebuild without words. He didn't smile, and he didn't cry. He simply folded the letter once more, neatly, precisely, and rose from his chair. In the hallway stood an old wooden cabinet, one he and Evelyn had kept for keepsakes. Photos, postcards, notes. On the top drawer, faded pencil letters still read, "Family." He opened it gently and slid the letter inside, between a photograph of Brian as a boy and a faded Christmas card Ella had made years ago. Then he closed the drawer softly. The sound echoed like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. Clara came by later that evening, bringing over a pie she'd baked. She found Tom sitting on the porch, the lamp beside him casting a warm circle of light against the dusk. "You're quiet tonight," she said, settling beside him. He nodded. "Letter from Brian," he said simply. Her brow lifted slightly. "And?" "It was honest." She studied him for a moment, the flickering lamplight reflecting in her eyes. "That's a start," she said. "You know, forgiveness isn't surrender." Tom turned the thought over, like a craftsman examining a piece of wood for its grain. "No," he said finally. "It's craftsmanship. Takes time." Clara smiled faintly. "And patience." He chuckled softly. "Patience I've got. The rest I'll build." They sat there in the gentle quiet, watching the light fade across the yard. Somewhere inside, the clock ticked steadily, a metronome for time passing, healing in its own rhythm. The letter stayed in the drawer, unseen but not forgotten. Like every scar on wood, it was proof of something once broken, now shaping into something new. The first warm breeze of spring carried the smell of soil and renewal through Oakwood Drive. Tom stood on his front porch early that Saturday morning, coffee in hand, watching as neighbors gathered along the sidewalks. It was the first community cleanup day he'd organized since reopening his workshop, a simple idea that had taken root fast. Children held rakes and shovels too big for their hands. Teenagers balanced. Wheelbarrows. Even old Mr. Jenkins from across the street shuffled over with his pruning shears. Ella darted back and forth between groups, clipboard in hand, directing like a professional. "Trees go in first," she shouted with cheerful authority. "Then we fix the fences." Tom smiled as he watched her, the next generation taking charge. Evelyn would have loved this. He moved slowly down the porch steps, greeting each volunteer. The day was bright, the kind that promised more beginnings than endings. He'd mended a lot over the winter, but today felt different. Larger, somehow. Not just personal restoration, but shared healing. The hum of conversation filled the air, mingled with the sound of hammers, laughter, and music from a small speaker someone had brought. The smell of cut grass and fresh paint hung sweet and clean. Tom knelt beside a fence post that had rotted through and began replacing it. His hands, though older now, still moved with precision. Ella joined him, handing nails one by one. "Grandpa, you're trending again," she teased, pulling out her phone. "Someone from the local paper posted about this cleanup." Tom chuckled softly. "Let's just hope they spell my name right this time." He drove another nail in, steady and sure. Around them, the neighborhood looked alive again. Kids planting saplings, mothers chatting, old fences finding new strength. Then a sudden hush rippled through the small crowd. Tom looked up, following their gazes toward the street. Brian was walking up the sidewalk, carrying a pair of work gloves in one hand and a hammer in the other. No fanfare, no words. Just the quiet weight of a man stepping back into the place where he'd lost everything. Tom straightened slowly, meeting his son's eyes across the lawn. The silence between them stretched taut, heavy enough to feel. But instead of turning away, Brian simply said, "Heard you could use an extra pair of hands." Tom studied him for a moment. The face was the same, but the posture was different, shoulders lower, pride tempered. Finally, Tom nodded toward the half-built fence. "Could use some help setting the rails." Brian's eyes softened with something like relief. "I can do that." And just like that, he joined in. No one spoke about the past. The tools filled the silence. They worked side by side, Tom driving posts, Brian hammering planks, the rhythm between them as familiar as it was fragile. Neighbors whispered, some watching in quiet awe, others pretending not to notice. Everyone remembered what had happened, but no one interrupted. It wasn't spectacle. It was repair. At one point, a little boy tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked, "Are they friends again?" The mother just smiled faintly and said, "They're trying." Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, shadows shortening across the yards. When the final tree was planted and the last fence panel secured, the group gathered for food and lemonade. Laughter returned easily now, like it had been waiting all along. Tom sat on the porch steps, wiping sweat from his brow. Brian stood a few feet away, watching Ella play with the younger kids. She looked over and waved him closer. "Come on, Dad," she called. "Dinner time." Brian hesitated only a moment before joining them at the long wooden table that stretched across the porch. The smell of roasted chicken and fresh bread filled the air. They ate in quiet at first, but comfort grew slowly, like light fading into dusk. When the plates were cleared, Ella disappeared inside for a moment and returned with a small speaker. "Thought we could use some music," she said. Then she pressed play. Evelyn's favorite song, an old folk tune she used to hum while cooking, drifted out softly into the evening air. Tom froze for just a moment, the melody catching him off guard. He glanced at Brian, who was staring down at his hands. But then, almost imperceptibly, Brian smiled. Small, genuine, unguarded. Ella started to sing along, her voice light and sure. The neighbors clapped quietly, some humming the tune themselves. Tom leaned back in his chair, eyes on the sky as it blushed with sunset. The sound of Evelyn's song mingled with the laughter around him. For the first time, peace didn't feel like a distant reward. It felt like a presence, breathing softly through the cracks of everything once broken. He looked over at Brian, who met his gaze. No words were needed. The silence between them had changed again, no longer heavy, just honest. The fences stood firm, the trees swayed in new soil, and the house, their house, finally sounded like home again. The afternoon sun filtered through Clara's office window, landing in soft stripes across a stack of legal folders. The faint hum of an old ceiling fan filled the quiet as Tom sat opposite her, his reading glasses perched low on his nose. He'd been here before, years ago, signing the trust that first secured the home. Now he was back to amend it, not out of anger, but clarity. Clara looked up from her papers. "Are you sure you want to do this today?" she asked. "There's no rush." Tom shook his head gently. "No time like now," he said. "It's not about who hurt me anymore. It's about who carried me through it." Clara smiled, understanding. "Ella." He nodded. "She never asked for anything, never turned away. She deserves the roof that stayed steady when the rest of us cracked." The pen sat between them, ordinary, yet symbolic. Clara slid the document forward. "This revision will transfer sole inheritance of the property to your granddaughter, Ella Marie Miller, upon your passing. The trust remains irrevocable after signing." Tom studied the words carefully. They felt right. He'd spent decades building this house with his hands and months rebuilding it with his heart. Now, it was time to make sure it stood for the right reasons. He picked up the pen, hesitated just long enough to feel the weight of it, and then signed his name, Thomas E. Miller. Clara reached for the papers, her movements practiced, steady. "There," she said. "Done." A knock came at the door. Clara glanced up. "Come in." Brian stepped inside quietly, removing his cap. His eyes flickered toward the desk, then to his father. I didn't mean to interrupt, he said. Ella told me you were here. Tom leaned back slightly. You're not interrupting. We just finished. Brian's gaze fell to the document. So, that's it? Tom nodded. The house will go to her. No arguments. No conditions. For a moment, Brian said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. Good, he said softly. That's how it should be. Clara watched the exchange carefully, saying nothing. This was between father and son now. Brian stepped closer, the light from the window catching the faint silver in his hair. You know, he said, his voice rough, I used to think owning this place would make me something, like it would prove I'd made it. But now... He trailed off, his eyes searching the floor. I don't need the house. I just needed you back. The air seemed to shift in the room. Quiet, heavy with sincerity. Tom looked up at his son, his expression softening. For months, he'd been building fences, sanding benches, mending the visible damage. But this moment, this was the real restoration. His voice came low, steady, and full of emotion. Then you've earned more than walls, Brian. Brian's eyes lifted, uncertain. Tom gestured gently toward his chest. You've earned your place again. The words hung there, simple, honest, enough. Clara stood slowly, gathering the signed papers. She placed them in a manila folder and tucked it into her cabinet with quiet reverence. Well, she said softly, that's the last document this house will ever need. Tom nodded, feeling a strange lightness settle over him. It wasn't victory, and it wasn't loss. It was completion, the kind that came after the long, hard work of forgiveness. As they stepped outside, the late afternoon breeze rustled through the budding trees. The house stood proud and still in the distance, its windows glowing with the reflection of the sun. Ella was waiting on the porch, sketchbook in hand. When she saw them, she waved, her smile wide and unguarded. Tom smiled back, a hint of pride in his eyes. She's the future of it all, he murmured. Brian nodded. And you're the reason she believes in it. They walked the path back together, slow, silent steps over familiar ground. The crunch of gravel beneath their feet was steady, unhurried. At the gate, Brian paused, his voice breaking slightly. Dad, he said, thank you for not shutting the door. Tom placed a hand on his shoulder. Doors can be rebuilt, he said, but you've got to knock first. Brian nodded, his throat tight with emotion. They stood there a moment longer, neither speaking. Then Brian turned to leave, glancing back once at the house, not with envy this time, but with peace. Tom watched him go, the sunlight catching the edges of the old porch railing. For the first time, the house didn't feel like a battlefield or a burden. It felt whole again, lived in, loved, and right. Clara's words echoed softly in his mind as he looked toward the front door. That's how legacy works, when redemption finally lands. Tom exhaled slowly, the weight lifting from his chest. He turned toward Ella's laughter inside and smiled. Snow fell lightly over Oakwood Drive, soft flakes swirling beneath the glow of porch lights. Inside the Miller home, warmth pulsed through the rooms, the steady crackle of the fireplace, the faint hum of Christmas music playing on an old radio, the quiet laughter drifting from the kitchen. A full year had passed since the courtroom, since the letters, since the rebuilding. Time hadn't erased the scars, but it had softened their edges, turning them into reminders rather than wounds. In the dining room, the long wooden table gleamed under the soft glow of candles. It was the same table that had once hosted years of silence and tension, now dressed in white linen and garland. The smell of roast turkey filled the air, Tom's doing, of course. Some traditions, he'd decided, deserved to outlast everything. He stood at the head of the table, carving knife in hand, his movements careful and sure. Each slice of turkey fell clean and even, as if precision still defined him. Around him, plates waited, forks gleamed, and conversation hummed low. Brian sat across from him, posture straight, quiet but present. The year had changed him too. His expression held humility now, not arrogance, the kind that comes from learning where pride once ruled. Want me to pour, Dad? Brian asked softly. Tom paused mid-cut, then nodded. Go ahead. Brian reached for the bottle of wine and poured into his father's glass first, the gesture deliberate, respectful. A simple act, but one that spoke volumes. Ella caught the moment and smiled to herself. She sat beside her grandfather, wearing a red sweater speckled with flour from helping in the kitchen. Her eyes glowed, not just with pride, but with peace. The sound of the door opening broke the rhythm of chatter. Heads turned. Standing in the doorway was Samantha, her coat dusted with snow, her expression uncertain. For a long second, no one moved. The years of betrayal hung in the air, faint but tangible, the ghost of old, choices standing between them. "Hi," Samantha said finally. Her voice was small, almost fragile. "I didn't want to intrude. I wanted to say Merry Christmas." Ella was the first to move. She got up and crossed the room, wrapping her arms around her mother. The embrace was awkward at first, then real. "You're not intruding," Ella said softly. Tom set down the carving knife and looked toward Samantha. His face remained unreadable, but his eyes carried none of the hardness they once had. He walked slowly toward her, stopping just close enough to be within the same air of forgiveness. She opened her mouth to speak again, but he raised a hand slightly, not to silence, but to spare her. Then he gave a single, quiet nod. No words, just understanding. Samantha's eyes filled, and she nodded back. She slipped off her coat, and Ella guided her to the table. The circle wasn't perfect, but it was whole enough. Tom returned to his seat. The sound of the knife against the cutting board resumed, calm, steady, grounding. He passed slices of turkey down the table, then looked around at the faces before him. The faces of a family that had nearly shattered, now tentatively, stubbornly mending. Conversation returned, lighter now. Stories surfaced about Ella's art exhibit, Brian's new volunteer work, Clara's latest case. Laughter came easier than it used to, though it still carried the echo of all they'd endured. At one point, Brian lifted his glass. "Dad," he said quietly, "you've set the bar high this year. The house looks better than ever." Tom smiled faintly. "That's Ella's doing," he said. "She's got her grandmother's touch." Ella blushed and raised her own glass. "Actually," she said, glancing around the table, "I think it's all of us. Every one of us built a piece of it back." She hesitated, then lifted her glass higher. "Two homes that stay warm." The words hung in the air, simple but perfect. Glasses clinked, the fire crackled. Outside, snow pressed gently against the windows, muting the world beyond. Inside, the house glowed, not from lights or candles, but from something less tangible, something finally right. Tom looked around the table, his heart full but still anchored in quiet reflection. He didn't think of revenge anymore, or loss, or even justice. He thought of belonging, of how it had nearly slipped away and how, through patience and pain, it had found its way back. Laughter swelled, filling the room until it felt almost alive. The camera would have pulled back here, through the window, across the snowy yard, rising over the glowing home, the sound of laughter trailing behind like music. The porch light glimmered faintly in the snow, the same one that had once watched a man be turned away, now watching a family return. And for the first time in years, Oakwood Drive felt like Christmas again. The house had gone quiet hours ago. The last of the dishes were washed, the leftover turkey wrapped, the laughter that had filled the dining room now lingering only as a faint echo in the walls. Outside, Oakwood Drive slept under a soft quilt of fresh snow, the world muffled, still and calm. Tom sat on the porch, wrapped in his old flannel robe, the lamp beside him casting a warm circle of light across the boards. The glow reached just far enough to illuminate the railing and the steps. The same steps he'd rebuilt with Ella last spring. Beyond that, darkness stretched into the white hush of winter. He took a slow sip from his mug, the cocoa rich and hot, and watched his breath curl in the cold air. The sound of the wind brushing the trees was steady and comforting. He could hear the faint hum of the furnace through the wall behind him, a small reminder that the house, at last, was alive again. The screen door creaked open behind him, and Clara stepped out, wearing a thick sweater and holding her own mug. "I figured you'd be out here," she said, her voice soft against the quiet. Tom smiled without turning. You figured right. She settled into the chair beside him, close enough that the lamplight caught the silver in her hair. I should have known. You were never good at sleeping when there was thinking to be done. He chuckled, low and rough. Old habits, he said. They sat together for a while, saying nothing. The porch had become their meeting ground through all the seasons, a place for plans, confessions, and now, quiet reflection. Clara set her mug on the small table between them and folded her hands in her lap. You did it, you know, she said after a moment. Tom looked over at her. Did what? She smiled faintly. You rebuilt more than a house. He took a slow breath, letting the words sink in. The porch light flickered gently against his face, casting the kind of shadows that made old men look both tired and eternal. I didn't see it that way, he said finally, at least not at first. Clara tilted her head. How do you see it now? Tom's gaze drifted out toward the yard. The snow was falling thicker now, soft flakes glinting as they passed through the lamplight. The trees stood still, their branches heavy with white. The house, his house, looked peaceful, content in a way it hadn't for years. It was never revenge, he said quietly. It was restoration. The word lingered, suspended in the cold air like breath. Clara nodded slowly. Restoration, she echoed. That's what Evelyn would have called it too. Tom smiled at that, the kind of smile that came from remembering without breaking. She always said there's a difference between fixing and healing, he murmured. Fixing makes something look right again. Healing makes it feel right. For a while they just listened, to the wind, to the faint creak of the old rocking chair, to the distant laughter that still seemed to live in the walls. Clara leaned back, eyes on the snow. You ever think about what comes next? He considered that for a moment, watching a single flake land on the porch rail and melt instantly. No, he said. Not much. I think about right now. This house, this moment. That's enough. She smiled softly. That's new for you, he chuckled. Took me 70 years to learn it. The lamplight flickered again, then steadied, glowing golden against the snow. Tom reached over and adjusted it slightly, his hands steady despite the cold. You know, he said, half to himself, I used to think this light was for me, so I could find my way home. But I think now it's for them. For who? Clara asked. He nodded toward the window, where faint silhouettes moved. Ella cleaning up in the kitchen, Brian stacking chairs. For them, he said softly. To remind them this house is theirs now, that the door will always be lit. Clara followed his gaze and smiled. That's a good legacy, Tom. He looked out once more, the glow of the lamp spilling into the snow. Maybe, he said, but it's just what a builder does. You build things to outlast you. The snow thickened, blurring the line between ground and sky. The porch light shone against it, unwavering, a beacon in the hush. Clara sipped her cocoa, her breath curling into the night. You think you'll ever turn it off? Tom smiled faintly, eyes soft and distant. Not while someone still needs to find their way back. The two of them sat in silence after that, the kind that said everything words couldn't. The world faded to white, the lamp glowing steady against the dark, a promise, quiet and unbroken. And as the snow fell heavier, blanketing Oakwood Drive in peace, the porch light burned on, a symbol of belonging, of forgiveness, of home. The morning light was gentle that day, spilling across the dining room table where stacks of papers waited in neat order. Tom sat there in his reading glasses, pen in hand, the familiar scent of fresh coffee and old paper surrounding him. He had built houses all his life, walls, beams, foundations. But this, he thought, this was the last thing he would build, order from chaos, a map for peace after he was gone. Across from him, Clara adjusted her glasses, flipping through the pages one final time. Everything's in place, she said softly. Once you sign here, the estate plan becomes final. Tom nodded. His movements were slow but deliberate. He picked up the pen, tested it against the edge of a folder, and then signed his name where the line waited. Thomas E. Miller. Clara pressed her hand lightly on the papers, sealing them under her palm for a moment. "That's it," she said, her voice catching slightly. "It's official." Tom leaned back, letting out a long breath. "Funny," he murmured. "You spend your whole life fighting to keep something. Then one day you give it away to make sure it stays." Clara smiled, though her eyes shimmered. "That's what stewardship looks like, Tom. You're not giving it up. You're passing it on." He nodded, his gaze softening. "Ownership is nothing without stewardship," he said quietly, as if testing how the words felt aloud. She looked up, recognizing the weight in them. "That's beautiful. You should write that down." He smiled faintly. "Already did." Beside the stack of legal papers sat two envelopes, one addressed to Ella, the other to Brian. His handwriting was slow, looping, deliberate. He'd written them the night before, sitting under the same lamp that had watched him through decades of work, loss, and restoration. Clara glanced at them now, her curiosity quiet but visible. "They'll appreciate those," she said. Tom nodded. "They're not instructions," he said, "just reminders." He took a sip of his coffee, the mug warm between his palms. "For Ella, I wrote about care, not just for the house, but for herself. Told her this place isn't her cage, it's her foundation. She can build whatever life she wants from it." Clara smiled softly. "She'll like that." "And for Brian," his voice faded for a moment. "I told him I forgave him, not because he earned it, but because I didn't want him to carry it any longer. I told him to build something honest, even if it's just a day at a time." Clara looked down, blinking fast. "He'll never forget that." Silence settled between them for a while, the kind that felt both heavy and kind. The clock on the wall ticked gently, marking time as it always had. Finally, Clara stood, collecting the signed documents and sliding them into her briefcase. "I'll file everything first thing in the morning," she said. "This will hold up cleanly. No confusion, no loopholes." Tom gave a small nod, his expression peaceful. "That's good. I don't want them fighting over wood and nails." She reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "They won't," she said quietly. "You've already built more than a house. You built understanding." He looked up at her with tired, kind eyes. "Didn't do it alone," he said. She smiled faintly, squeezing his shoulder. "None of us ever do." When she left, the house grew still again. The papers remained on the table for a moment, the ink still drying, before Tom gathered the envelopes and carried them into the study. He placed Ella's letter in her sketchbook, where he knew she'd find it one day, and tucked Brian's into the drawer beside his tools. Then he turned off the lamp and stood for a while, looking out the window. The yard was quiet, the porch light glowing faintly against the dusk. Everything felt in its place. That night, when he finally lay down, the air in the house seemed different, settled, complete. The creaks in the floor no longer spoke of absence, but of life still moving. And as sleep took him, the last thing Tom Miller felt was peace, not fleeting, but earned. His work, his family, his legacy, all finally where they belonged. The oak tree stood tall at the back of the Miller property, its branches reaching out like arms that had sheltered generations. Tom had always said it was the oldest living thing on the land, older than the house, older than him, maybe even older than memory. It had seen every season of his life, from the day he came home from the war to the day he lost Evelyn. Now it stood waiting again, as if it knew another chapter was about to be written. The morning was clear and mild. Birds chirped lazily overhead as Tom and Ella unloaded pieces of wood from the truck. The boards were smooth, sanded by hand, the same oak finish Tom had used on the porch years ago. Ella wiped sweat from her forehead, squinting up at the tree. "You sure this is where you want it?" Tom smiled faintly. "Best spot on the property," he said. "Your grandmother and I used to sit here after dinner. She'd say the wind through the leaves sounded like conversation." Ella grinned. "Then it's perfect." They began assembling the bench, Tom measuring and guiding, Ella hammering with quiet focus. The rhythm of work was familiar now, passed down like an unspoken language. The sound of wood meeting metal echoed softly through the yard, blending with the rustle of the branches overhead. After an hour, The bench took shape, sturdy, simple, beautiful, the kind of thing that didn't need to be explained. Tom reached into his tool bag and pulled out a small carving knife. Ella watched, curious. "What's that for?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he crouched beside the bench, his movements slow but sure. The blade pressed into the wood with care, tracing letters into the smooth surface. When he finished, he stepped back and gestured for her to read. The carving was small but precise. E plus T plus E. Family, finished. Ella ran her fingers over the letters. "Grandma Evelyn," she said softly. Tom nodded. "She was the start of it, and you're the continuation." The sunlight shifted through the leaves, dappling the bench in patterns of gold and shadow. For a long moment, neither spoke. It was the kind of silence that didn't ask for words. Full, complete, alive. Then a voice came from behind them. "Need an extra set of hands?" They turned to see Brian walking across the yard, toolbox in hand. His steps were slower now, but steady. Tom smiled faintly. "You're late," Brian grinned. "Some things don't change." He knelt beside them and began tightening bolts, helping to anchor the bench into the soil. They worked in companionable silence, the kind of teamwork that required no forgiveness because it was already understood. When the last bolt was set, they stood together, looking at the finished piece. "It's beautiful," Ella said. "It's honest," Tom replied. Brian nodded. "You always did make things. That last." Tom glanced at him, a small warmth in his eyes. "Tried to." As they packed up, a couple from down the road wandered over, drawn by curiosity. "That's a fine bench," the man said. "You planning to leave it here for the neighborhood?" Tom smiled. "Something like that. A place to rest, to remember." Word spread quickly. Within days, the bench became a quiet gathering spot. Kids on bicycles stopping to catch their breath, older couples sitting beneath the shade, young families taking photos beside the carving. It wasn't fancy, but it carried a kind of peace that people felt even if they didn't understand why. Tom often sat nearby, pretending to read the newspaper while secretly watching. He saw laughter, quiet moments, life moving forward, exactly as it should. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, Ella joined him, sketchbook in hand. She began to draw the bench, capturing the carved initials and the way the light touched the wood. When she finished, she showed him the drawing. "What do you think?" Tom looked at it for a long moment. "It's good," he said softly. "Simple beauty. That's the hardest kind to make." The wind moved through the oak branches above, whispering like an old friend. Tom leaned back, eyes on the carving, family, finished, and smiled. For the first time in a long time, he felt no pull toward the past, just stillness, just belonging. Years had passed, though time seemed to move differently inside the old Miller workshop. The garage still smelled faintly of sawdust and varnish, the air holding that same quiet hum of purpose, even though the man who built it no longer stood at the bench. Ella unlocked the side door early that morning, just as the first light of day crept across the floorboards. She flicked on the overhead lamp, the warm glow landing on the neatly arranged tools along the wall. Chisels, clamps, hammers, all exactly where Tom had left them. Not one had been moved. Not one would ever be. She walked slowly past the workbench, her hand grazing the surface. Every scratch, every dent, told a story. There was the mark from the first table she'd built with him when she was 10, the small burn near the edge from his pipe, the shallow groove where he'd once carved her name as practice for her first project. It wasn't an empty workshop at all, just one where the silence spoke louder than noise ever could. Behind her, the door creaked open. Brian stepped in, wiping his hands on a rag. His hair was grayer now, but his shoulders were straight, his expression calm. "You're in early," he said, voice carrying the low warmth of familiarity. Ella smiled without looking up. "Just couldn't sleep. Figured I'd start before the kids arrive." He nodded, glancing around. "Still smells like him," he said softly. "Yeah," she murmured, "like work and coffee and cedar." Brian smiled faintly. The man had a way of making even dust smell. Productive. They shared a quiet laugh. the kind that belonged to people who'd learned to hold memory gently. On the far wall hung a framed photograph. Tom, standing outside the shop with Ella at 16, both grinning, holding the first chair they ever finished together. Beneath it hung a small brass plaque with words Tom had once said, "You belong where you build." Ella paused in front of it, eyes soft. "That was the last thing he told me before I took over," she said. "I thought he meant the workshop. Took me a while to realize he meant life." Brian came to stand beside her. "He always knew how to make lessons sound like riddles," he said. She smiled. "That was his craft too." The door swung open again, and a small crowd of neighborhood kids filtered in, the next generation of builders. They carried scraps of pine and small toolboxes, laughter filling the air as they settled into their places. "All right, everyone," Ella called, clapping her hands. "Same rule as always. Measure twice, cut once, and don't forget to sweep up your mistakes." The kids chuckled, picking up their tools. Saw blades began to hum. Sandpaper whispered against wood, and soon the workshop came alive again. Brian moved to the back, grabbing a hammer. "Need me to help set up the vise?" "Please," she said, grateful. Together, they worked in rhythm. Easy, practiced, unspoken. There was no trace of the man who'd once lost his way, only the one who'd chosen to rebuild beside his daughter. Visitors often came by during the day, curious locals, parents, sometimes tourists, passing through town who'd heard about the Miller workshop. They'd walk in, glance around at the framed photos and old tools, and pause by the quote on the wall. One woman whispered to her son, "That's his saying," the builder who taught the whole town about family. Ella overheard but said nothing. She just smiled, knowing her grandfather would have deflected the praise. By late afternoon, the sunlight slanted through the open windows, coating everything in gold. Dust motes floated like slow-moving stars. The kids cleaned their benches, chatting softly as they left for the day. When the last one was gone, Ella turned off the machines. The workshop fell into its familiar hush again, that sacred kind of silence that felt like presence, not absence. Brian set down his hammer, stretching his back. "He'd be proud of you," he said quietly. Ella turned to him, smiling through the warmth in her eyes. "He'd be proud of us," she replied. They stood together a moment longer, looking at the tools, the light, the walls, that still whispered memory. Outside, the old oak swayed in the breeze, its branches framing the window like an old photograph come to life. Inside, legacy breathed, not heavy, not sad, just eternal. The afternoon light spilled gently through the living room windows, warm and golden, touching everything it landed on. The carved banister, the polished floors, the framed photographs lining the mantel. The Miller home, after all the years, still carried the quiet hum of life. Ella sat by the window seat, a worn leather journal resting open in her lap. Its pages were yellowed, corners bent from years of use. She turned one carefully, her fingers tracing the handwriting that had once belonged to the man who had built not just the house, but everything that mattered inside it. Her grandfather's voice echoed softly in her mind as she read aloud, his words steady and unpretentious, like him. "They said I didn't belong, but I wrote my name in wood and memory." She stopped, smiling faintly. That line, the one she'd seen him write by lamplight when she was little, still carried the weight of everything he had lived through. Betrayal, loss, forgiveness. The way he'd rebuilt not only walls, but hearts. The house was alive now. From the kitchen came the soft clatter of dishes and the sound of Brian's laughter mixing with Clara's voice. A radio played somewhere, an old song Evelyn had once loved. The air smelled of coffee and pine polish, the same scent that had defined her childhood. Ella closed the journal gently, holding it to her chest. For a moment, she just sat there, feeling the stillness, the kind that isn't empty, but full of memory, of voices that linger long after they've gone quiet. She stood and walked through the living room, her footsteps soft on the hardwood floors her grandfather had once laid himself. Each creak felt familiar, each detail a story. The bookshelf he'd built still stood by the fireplace, its edges smooth from decades of touch. The old workshop keys still hung on their hook by the door. In the hallway, sunlight caught the edge of a small brass plaque mounted near the front door. She stopped and looked at it. The engraving was simple, unadorned, the way Tom would have wanted it. Thomas Miller, builder and father. The letters gleamed faintly in the light, as though alive. Ella reached out and brushed the surface with her fingertips, her eyes glistening. Behind her, Brian appeared quietly, wiping his hands on a towel. "Reading his journal again?" he asked. Ella nodded, smiling. "Every time I do, I find something new." He stepped beside her, looking at the plaque. "He really did build everything here," he said softly. "Yeah," she replied, "but not just the house." Brian looked at her, a question in his eyes. "He built belonging," she said simply, "even when it was broken." Brian swallowed, emotion catching in his throat. He nodded, then rested his hand briefly on her shoulder before walking toward the kitchen, where laughter was still bubbling like music. Ella stayed by the door a moment longer. She looked around, at the light spilling across the walls, the warmth in every corner, the subtle traces of her grandfather in everything, from the craftsmanship to the feeling of peace that filled the air. The camera would have pulled back here, from her hand on the plaque to the larger frame of the house. Through the doorway, you could see family gathered at the table, the fire burning low, the sound of life continuing exactly as it should. The shot would linger, slow and cinematic, as though the house itself were breathing. And in that breath, in the warmth of wood and laughter and forgiveness, Tom Miller's legacy lived on. Outside, the porch light flickered on automatically, casting a steady glow over the snow-dusted yard. Inside, Ella picked up the journal once more, her voice soft as she whispered the last line he'd ever written. "Some homes are built twice, once with hands, once with forgiveness." The music swelled gently, strings and piano full and tender, as the image faded to black. The porch light remained, glowing in the quiet, a symbol of belonging, a promise kept,